to start this morning by thanking our project partners, and you're going to be hearing from many of them this morning with some excellent presentations. Our project partners include Wright Pierce, the Center for Coastal Studies, Woods Hole Sea Grant and the County Cooperative Extension, Cape Cod National Seashore, and Boston University. Of course, the Alliance, I should start by also introducing the Alliance, which is, as many of you know, the organization of the towns of Orleans, Chatham, Harwich, and Brewster, which was formed about 25 years ago to oversee the management program for the Pleasant Bay area of critical environmental concern. I also want to take a moment to thank a number of organizations who have co-sponsored this community forum with us. Friends of Pleasant Bay, Friends of Chatham Waterways, Pleasant Bay Community Boating, Orleans Pond Coalition, and Chatham Climate Action Network. Many thanks to those organizations and their volunteers, many of whom are working this morning as well, helping us get the word out and ensure that we had a good turnout for this event. So thank you very much for taking time out of a busy Saturday morning to meet with us to talk about this important topic. And as I was preparing for this meeting this morning, I was thinking about, when the Alliance just got off the ground 25 years ago, and I know many of you were involved at the time, so it's great to see so many friends and colleagues in person. But I was thinking about it, how at that time when we were just getting off the ground, we were launching a water quality monitoring program all across Pleasant Bay that was focused on collecting information about nutrient loading and the extent of nutrient concentration in our waters. Just really a burgeoning process of awareness about that critical issue that led to so many designs and plans for managing the excessive nutrients in Pleasant Bay. And at that time, there really wasn't a great awareness of the problem. And as communities started to formulate plans and seek to get funding at town meeting for comprehensive wastewater management plans and early designs of remediation efforts, they faced some strong headwinds. And I fast forward to today, 25 years later, and we have the first watershed permit in the Commonwealth for Pleasant Bay to control nutrient loading. And our communities are actively investing in measures to address the problem. So I really view that as a tremendous success, although many of us would wish things happened a lot quicker. Progress has really been made. And I really view this issue of climate resilience as very similar. However, part of what we're trying to do is raise awareness of the issues and engage our communities in planning and preparation and taking measures to increase the resilience of Pleasant Bay. And we want to do it obviously as quickly as we can because time is of the essence. So I know from just looking around the room that many of you know far more about the Pleasant Bay estuary than I do. You've lived and enjoyed the estuary and lived around the estuary for many, many years. It is an extraordinary resource. It's the largest estuary on Cape Cod. It's a nursery that supports the sustainability of our ocean fisheries. It has extensive wetland resources that provide habitat value, that filter pollutants, that protect us from storm surge. It's a place we all enjoy. We have homes and businesses and major roadways around the bay. We have 27 public access points. And all of those incredible ways we enjoy the bay and all of those important environmental resources are threatened today by potential effects of climate. That includes rising water levels. It includes increasing water temperatures. It means more frequent and more potent storms that can cause erosion. So this is a concern we have, and the Alliance has been thinking about this for some time. Since 2005, we've been working with Center for Coastal Studies, Mark Borelli and Graham Guys and others, to measure tide levels in Pleasant Bay. We have quite an extensive data set. We've done a fair amount of work with Center for Coastal Studies to understand the migration of the Barrier Beach system, which is an important part of what protects our inner shoreline from storms. We also took a step in 2016, 2017 to prepare a sea level rise assessment, also prepared by Center for Coastal Studies, that at that time showed us that we could lose a quarter to a half of our intertidal resources due to inundation caused by climate effects. And you know, that was a red flag for us. We understood that we needed to begin to deepen our knowledge and begin to not only learn more, but start to formulate and take action. One of the things that we did is to develop the guidelines for erosion management in Pleasant Bay, which are intended as a resource document for conservation commissions, for shoreline property owners and practitioners and others who are interested to understand how we can find that sweet spot where we provide some erosion protection, but we also allow the critical movement of sediment in our system that is so crucial to the health of salt marsh and tidal flats and beaches. We also are piloting a living shoreline project at Jackknife Harbor Beach in Chatham. And if you're familiar with that heavily used public access point, it is a beautiful spot for launching a kayak. There's a mooring field there. There's one of the very few public beach areas there. There's a narrow access road you can see on this figure and some fringe marsh. And that channel goes right under the bridge under Muddy Creek and up into Muddy Creek. And so there's a lot of current that goes through there. There's a lot of public use of that particular location. And that strip of marsh, which is really protecting that access, is disappearing rapidly. And so we've been designing a living shoreline project to pilot a new approach to sort of protecting and rebuilding that marsh using coir populated with ribbed mussels. It's a technique that's not frequently used. It's not really something that Massachusetts is used to permitting, and that's why it's considered a pilot project. And we've been working very closely with Center for Coastal Studies, with Coastal Zone Management and our consultants Wilkinson Ecological Design and Sustainable Coastal Solutions to develop that project. So that's in the permitting phases, and we hope to be through permitting this year, and construction could potentially start under the auspices of the town of Chatham next year. So we have those efforts underway. We also recognize that we need to take maybe even a more broad view in developing a plan of action to increase the resilience of Pleasant Bay. And so we have, we're lucky enough to obtain a grant from the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, which is a state program providing funding to communities for increasing climate resilience. And our project looks at the future of the Barrier Beach as well as our intertidal resource area. So we're looking at the Barrier Beach and the inner shoreline and surrounding intertidal resources. Within that envelope, we're looking at our public access locations and trying to assess their vulnerability. We are looking at water protection infrastructure. And what we mean by that is water mains, sewer infrastructure. This is public infrastructure, not private septic systems, but infrastructure that towns are investing in right now to protect our water quality. Our storm water management system, where are there vulnerabilities there due to climate effects? So important infrastructure that's part of our life around Pleasant Bay. But we're equally concerned with the bay as an estuary and its sustainability and its resilience to continue to function as an estuary. And we are really fortunate to be working with scientists from Cape Cod National Seashore and Boston University on the really interesting work they're doing on salt marsh and eelgrass restoration. And we're going to hear more about that today as well. So this past year, we've been gathering a lot of information on these topics, and that's what we're going to present to you today. A key part of developing this climate adaptation action plan is engaging stakeholders, is having you be part of the conversation and helping us identify priorities, because at the end of the day, an action plan is only useful if it's implemented. and if it has the support of the community, because it will take investments, and it may take changes in regulation, and those require public support. So it's vitally important that this be a community-based plan. And so this forum is a key part of our efforts to inform and engage the community in this work. We also have had, and many of you I hope have already participated in our online survey. We're going to talk a little bit about the interim findings. We're going to keep that open a while longer. But we're trying to create a variety of opportunities for people to be involved. And we're going to be talking a little bit later about some additional workshops we're planning that will be virtual to continue the conversation around specific resilience strategies. So our agenda for today, just very quickly, following my remarks, we're going to hear our first couple of presentations from Greg Berman and Mark Borelli that are really going to help us understand sort of the broad outlines of the climate effects that we are thinking about for the Pleasant Bay Estuary. And then after they have a chance to share their information, we're going to have 3 presentations on those specific areas I mentioned: public access and water protection infrastructure, salt marsh, and eelgrass. And after each of those sort of blocks, we'll have opportunities for questions. So we won't be taking questions within the presentations, but there will be plenty of opportunities for Q&A. We're going to break for lunch, and then we're going to, and lunch will be in the back room there. You can just circle right through there. And then we'll try to reconvene right at 12:20 to give a brief presentation on the results of the survey to date. And then we're going to have a panel discussion about how we move this resilience conversation forward, particularly within our municipal government. And then we'll take a few minutes just to wrap up. So that's our game plan. At this point, I would like to invite our first speaker, Greg Berman, Coastal Resource Specialist with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute Sea Grant Program and Barnstable County Extension Service. Thank you, Greg.
Good. I was worried we might need to update. Thank you, Carol. Thank you for inviting me to present today. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. This is, if you can't hear me in the back, just kind of wave and I'll get closer to the microphone. Thank you. So I'm here today to talk about sea level rise. We're going to be talking a lot about vulnerability and adaptation methods, but really sea level rise is the starting point, or sea level is the starting point. The rising sea level means we have a more dangerous starting point moving into the future. So we're going to be going fairly rapidly through this, but I'm happy to take questions at the end or talk during lunch. The idea of sea level is that really we're only going to talk about the last 25,000 years ago. But sea level has changed significantly throughout millennia. Ever since it's been a sea, it's gone up and down. But the last glacial maximum was about 25,000 years ago. At this point, you can kind of see this green line here. That was all exposed continental shelf. There was so much more of our water and trapped up in ice on land. We didn't have as much water in the ocean itself. So this ice started melting fairly significantly, and then by about 15,000 years ago, all the ice in this immediate area had melted away. But that doesn't mean that the rest of the glacial ice had melted. It was still melting further north and moving down. About 11,000 years ago, hopefully you can see on this image, the green here was still all dry land. So there wasn't much good fishing out on George's Bank. You know, the glacial sheet continued to melt, providing water. And even 6,000 years ago, you could have walked from where we are right now out to the islands. No ferry needed. This is also a period during which, you know, instead of this fairly minimal fetch, the distance for wind and waves, now we're getting to a much greater oceanic fetch and really started driving a lot of the erosion around the outer cape. And here we are present day, with still the remnants of that exposed shelf visible on bathymetry. So I've been talking about sea level rise for a relatively long time in my mind, and I've had to change the way I talk about it just since I started about 15, 20 years ago. So back when I started, we would talk about how thermal expansion and the melting of land ice are the primary drivers of sea level rise. If we think way back to our chemistry classes, when things get hotter, they get bigger. There's more space between the molecules. No difference with the ocean, right? So literally, when it heats up, it gets a little bit bigger, and it's just on such a large scale you start seeing impacts with that. That's relatively easily measured compared to the dynamics of melting land ice. However, since this period, it's flipped. It used to be dominated by thermal expansion, and ever since this period, now it's mostly melting land ice is the primary contributor to sea level rise. Additionally, I used to kind of get frustrated, like it was so close to a foot over 100 years, why can't I just round up when I first started talking? Now it is a foot per 100 years. And so you start thinking about that, like, what's changed over the last 10 or 20 years to increase that 100-year rate by an inch or so? So if you look back in the 2010 range, it really was only about 11 inches per year, and now we're very close to a foot. Well, if you actually go into measured water level data, so this is at the Woods Hole tide gauge, we actually have measurements for almost 100 years there. The 100-year rate is just about a foot per year, but our last 20 years is significantly higher. What that means is that in the last 20 years, we've about doubling the speed of sea level rise over the last 100. Now, it's important to note that different periods can be cherry-picked, right? So for this 5-year span, sea level was actually falling. For this 1-year span, it was going up quite a bit. So I try to at least go for a multi-decadal trend change, and we've been experiencing this for 20 years. If you've heard about the sea level rise hockey stick, we're kind of on it now. We're on that curve. And it's affecting us. It's affecting how storms are hitting. So Hurricane Sandy, I think everybody knows, there were some pretty wicked nor'easters shortly after Hurricane Sandy, but really in 2018, we had a very significant water level. It wasn't that big of an erosion event, but it was a very high water level relatively. So you can see here's our water levels of 10, 10, and that one's at 15.2. That actually beat our previous water level record, which was only 15, so it beat it by a couple of inches. But if you think about it, and I think Mark showed me this the other day, it broke the Chatham gauge, but you can kind of interpolate between that it went quite high. So this is another point I wanted to bring across. These are Boston water levels, there's Chatham water levels. Every analysis area is going to have a slightly different value for that storm. But we have measured water level data at these sites. And at least in Boston, it's been about 6.5 inches of measured water level change during those 40 years. So the 2018 storm, it only broke the record because it had a higher starting water level. Our new storm of record is because of sea level rise. Now, we're going to have to go through a little bit of the alphabet soup before I get into the introduction of projections. So we're going to get into this particular image in the next slide, the actual what sea level is projected to do in the future. So the MVP is up there in our corner. Now what that actually stands for is the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. They are, I'd say, primarily a funding agency that, everyone did their MVP plans, including the various towns around Pleasant Bay. They also funded the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center to come up with these downscale projections. So there's global climate models, they go down to the US, and now they go down to even various parts around Massachusetts. And that's what this resulted from. The MCFRM, Massachusetts Coastal Flood Risk Model, that is using one of these projections to come up with very specific storm surge and wave predictions into the future based on a sea level rise scenario. Woods Hole Group is the private company who created the MCFRM. This is not the Woods Hole Sea Grant. That's the group I'm with. Gets confusing at times. So here is the projections put forth by those groups. And I'm not going to get too much into this, but just realize this is probabilistic projections, right? So we used to talk about our best guess for projections, but now we're saying we're pretty sure it's not going to be worse than a certain sea level raise height at a particular date. And so these are all the 8.5 for the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. So it's one of their worst scenarios, and then they use different probabilities of it. So this kind of lightish blue is 83% sure it won't be worse than that. And then it goes all the way up to 99.9% sure it won't be worse than that by a certain date. And you can see when you get out to 2100, there's a significant range between those probabilities, especially that you've got about 8 feet here at 99.5, and you've got over 10 feet at 99.9. Why we need that last 0.4, I don't know. I don't think anywhere in Chatham has that kind of infrastructure that's going to need that level of certainty. And then here's what our actual measurements have been. They've tracked pretty closely with that lower intermediate. So for some of the projects that we'll be talking about today, this is the MCFRM probability. So the 99.5 is what's used there. And so that's used for gray infrastructure, this top image in the table. So that's just where those fairly static water level ranges would hit. And then for the green infrastructure, we use an intermediate low, and I'll kind of explain the rationale behind that a little later in the talk. And here's just the last 20 years, right? That doubling of the rate, what that would be if you extrapolate it into the future with no, acceleration of that rate. So you can see we're pretty much at this already, and it might even be faster than this. And just trying to talk about the probability again. So this is all the same model. It's just looking at the error bars. We don't talk about best guess for these particular things. If you can kind of see that weird highlight, we're really close to 100%, but not quite. And then down here, we're 83% sure. Our best guess is 50%. That's somewhere in there. But this is, a very cartoonish way of looking at the entire range of projections in there. Now, this is an image. You don't need to be able to see it here because Wright Pierce will be sharing that with us in a bit. But I did just want to talk about the various parts of it. So the MCFRM is used in this. One of the aspects is the water surface elevation. If you know FEMA mapping, that's probably close to the still water for a 100-year floodplain, whereas the DFE, designed flood elevation, is closer to a BFE. Not perfectly compatible, but you can kind of wrap your minds around it that way. And just to keep in mind, this is the 1% annual exceedance, which is also called the 100-year storm. No guarantee there's 100 years between them, but it's any year it has a 1% chance of happening. If we want to kind of look at that 100-year 1% thing, here is the actual water level record from Woods Hole. Those are observations. The black lines, you can see the 1938 storm and Carroll coming in there, and then those red, orange lines. The red, that's the 1% chance, the 1 in 100. And you can see you actually have 2 over that time. Now, when we increase sea level, just even a couple of feet, you're starting to get 2 100-year storms during that same time frame if all the storms stay exactly the same, which, knock on wood, they should stay the same. Another thing that's, quite concerning in my mind also, including the additional areas that are going to get flooded, you're getting more frequent flooding, right? So here our 10-year flood is now turning into an annual year flood. And that certainly changes by location. So here we are looking at the figure again, just kind of pulling up that upper left-hand corner. So the MCFRM has that still water elevation, and then you add waves, so you go even higher. I probably should have put enough room in here on the next slide, but here's our storm of record. That's that 2018 storm. And there we go. There's our bottom part. And this is just a normal tide cycle. Mean high water, mean low water, and this kind of little peak on the top of mean high water. We don't have time to get into a full explanation of tides themselves, but tides are driven by the moon and the sun. Over here, we have spring tides because, gravity is all lined up. You get bulges that create higher tides. The neap tides have that 90-degree angle, so it's not going to be as high of a tide. This spring tide over on the right is called a lot of things. High tide flooding, nuisance flooding, blue sky flooding, spring tides, king tides. I think they might even be all called these various things today. So just to keep in mind, it's those higher water levels we're talking about. And then this is that higher water level, right? So it's above mean high water, it's all the way up here. I kind of wish I had put the storm of record on here. That was about 7, because you're just increasing this same range and just bumping it up by whatever that sea level rise scenario is. It's very close to that 7 as the nuisance flooding. So the happening during that monthly or seasonal spring tides. And then over here, just to understand, the word datum is going to be thrown around a couple of times. So we've got mean high water, mean low water. These are all just vertical elevations. And then above mean high water, we've got that high tide flooding. And these are all in mean low water. Here's mean lower low water and NAVAD 88. Just to keep in mind, if the numbers aren't clicking, it's probably a datum issue used between the various organizations. And I've just got a couple more slides. So when we're using this information, or when the next folks get up and state the vulnerability and how we're going to fix it, better them than I, we're talking about the various adaptation methods, right? So this is kind of a sliding scale of shoreline management techniques. You often hear green versus gray and kind of the blend between them. And one of the advantages for a property owner over at the right hand of that scale is you often hear revet it and forget it, right? So I don't need to worry about this ever again. It's not actually true. This is an image from the CZM's property comparison sheet, and it's very, fuzzy, generic ballpark numbers. But the idea is, you still have a multi-decadal scale where it's going to need to be maintained in some level. Some of these greener ones need much more frequent maintenance. But that is one of the aspects why we took a look at that 99.5% for these higher lifespan structures. If you're building something that's going to last for 50, 70 years, you really don't have the aspect of going back and adapting it. And that's one of the aspects of greener infrastructure, living shorelines, marshes, planting vegetation, things like that. You can think of that as more adaptable, right? So the time scale of these just allow for something called adaptive management. And we won't get too much into this, but just understand, if this is your increasing risk and you do a static, like seawall per se, you kind of maintain that level of risk. But if you do planting, and then that's no longer effective, and then you go to living shorelines and no longer effective, it's the idea of finding a pathway of, we'll do this for this long, and then that won't work, and then we'll go over here and do this, and then eventually we might need to do this. And the idea is trying to get that plan early in the system so you don't feel like you're locked into maintaining one of these earlier methods. And with that, I think Carol said we'll save questions till the end of the session, but happy to chat then or lunch.
Thank you very much, Greg. And now, Mark Borelli, Center for Coastal Studies.
All right. I think Greg should always go in front of me because he explained all that really well, and I don't have to. That's really good. Thank you. All right. So we're just going to jump right in here. We're talking about a few different things in this talk. I'm looking forward to getting questions after. So basically what we're talking about, we want to talk about what's going on in the Bay shoreline, the intertidal resources there, and also the barrier beach. So we're kind of covering all the bases here. And we're basically going to do it in 2 different ways. We're going to talk about the storm tide pathway mapping that we did, and I'll explain that. And that's going to it's going to help us understand the Bay shoreline and the intertidal resources. And then we're going to do some barrier beach analysis, or talk about what we're doing. We're sort of in the middle of it. And we're going to talk about the drone surveys that we're doing out there, and then talk about all the analysis that's ongoing. So you're going to hear this term a lot, mapping of storm tide pathways. So what are they? So I'll just walk you through it rather than do the whole preamble. We've got to move right through this. What we do is we start at the highest high tide of the year, right? And then we add the storm of record, which here, as Greg was mentioning, was the blizzard of 2018, right? January 4th, 2018. And then we add 2 to 3 feet for sea level rise. So what we want to do is we want to start right at that highest high tide of the year, where the flooding gets typically without a storm. And then we go in half-foot increments, and we're mapping where the water is going to go in half-foot increments to the storm of record and then beyond to account for sea level rise. All right. So that's what the storm type pathways do. And again, I'm going to walk you through it. We've done this in a bunch of different places. We are actually right now, we just finished up Martha's Vineyard in the south coast, and obviously we're going to talk about what we're doing here today. So we have done this in a lot of places. I think the first one is 2015, 2016. Yikes, so it's been 6-7 years. So I want to talk about how we do it, and we're going to show you some data from Pleasant Bay, obviously. So I always show these first couple slides. This is how we started. Basically what happens is we use LiDAR data. I'm the director of the seafloor mapping program at the Center for Coastal Studies, so we have all the software that helps us with spatial analysis. So this is LiDAR. This is like sonar and radar, but we use light. This is from a plane, and the light bounces off the surface, comes back up. Yep. Can I talk slower? Sure. I thought I was going slow, but okay. All right. So this is light detection and radar. This is LiDAR data, right? It's similar to radar, similar to sonar, but instead of using radio waves or sound waves, we use light waves. The plane will fly over. In this instance, it's from a plane. The plane flies over the land, bounces light down onto the surface, bounces back up, and we can actually create a really high resolution map using this technique. So it's really nice topographic data, and sometimes bathymetric data if you have the right instruments. So we zoom in using our software. This downtown Provincetown, right? And this is, so Steve McGew and I, in 2013, 2014, we would zoom in on websites like this, Surging Seas, and these are really nice websites when you're looking at very broad areas, right? When Surging Seas conducts these maps or develops these maps, they do them like state by state, right? They do really broad areas. So they're really, really useful until you want to look at sort of street by street resolution. So here, this is as tight as you can zoom in Provincetown, right? Can't get in any tighter. Now, this is not great if you're a DPW director, if you're someone who needs to understand where the water's going to go and how it's going to get there. So Steve and I were thinking about this, using the same data that they use, right? We're all using this really nice LiDAR data. Using the same data that they use, we came up with this idea. So we're going to go back to our LiDAR data. We bring it into our software. We can drape the aerial photograph over that surface, right? So now the aerial photograph is a three-dimensional surface, right? We zoom in, and now within our software, we can start to raise the water up, and we slowly raise it up. No hydrologic connection yet. And then right before you get to water flowing through town, you start to understand, how the water is going to get there. You can actually draw a line through this three-dimensional data. It's like slicing a cake, right? And you raise the water up, and you know that right here, you have a storm tide pathway. If you stop the water flowing here, the water won't get here. And that's as simple as it is. There's no probability, right? Actually, the probability is 100%. Once the water gets there, there's going to be water there, right? That's all we're doing. We're just making a map. We're not making predictions. Same thing here. This is the big one. If water gets here, this whole neighborhood gets flooded. Now, this was the cover image on the 2016 report we did for Provincetown. 2016. And what happened in 2018? I'm going to ask you to keep your eyes on the flower pot. Yeah, let me play this for you. Oh, it's not going to play. So the video's not going to play. That's a bummer. So the video's not playing. Were this video to play, you would see water flowing. This is right where that spot was, right? That's where this storm tide pathway was. There's about a foot of water. This is salt water coming from Provincetown, right? And this did a huge amount of damage in town. Let me see if the next one's going to go. No, next one's not going to go either. Oh, well, that's okay. All right, so basically what we do is when we're done with this, when we have our maps, we have all this really nice data. Oh, I'm spinning here. Okay. Oh, is this one going to go? No, this is not going to go either. Okay, that's all right. So we have this really nice data. We have the exact elevation. This is a mean low water, so we know, again, when the water gets to this level, right? When the water gets to 13.7 feet, there's going to be water here, right? And we know how much water is there if the water is above that. So if it's 14.7, there's a foot of water here, right? So it tells you how the water gets in there, where it goes and how it actually flows. And for each one of these, we get our GPS, and that's why we know where the location is. We start with the LiDAR data, and we use the GPS to know exactly where we are in terms of elevation. There's a lot of different ways to use this. This is Truro data, and we're going to look here. This is a secondary evacuation route, and when you overlay the LiDAR data, you can see that it tells you when you do the analysis in the lab, okay, the water's going to flow under the culvert, and it's going to cross over the road there, right? When we go out into the field, though, when we actually did this, we realized, no, that's where the water's going to flow over, right? It's going to flow over from this side. And if this is an evacuation route and you're going to sort of address these issues, you really have to know which way the water's coming. So going out there and doing this work in the field is really important. Now, I'm guessing this video is not going to work either, but that's okay. Water flows over the road. Yeah, okay. That's all right. That's okay. Not sure what's happening there, but all right. So the other thing, so we talked about us going to the storm of record, and then we went 2 or 3 feet above that to incorporate sea level rise. So we're back in Provincetown now. Once you get to this area, because you know we talk about people building structures and people trying to protect their homes or protect flooding. People aren't going to be here. We are not going to be here in 50, 100 years. The towns are always going to be here. Towns aren't going anywhere. Towns have to take a long-term view of this, right? So when they start thinking about future sea level rise, and you know we're going 2, 3, 4 feet above the storm of record, that's because of things like this. So now we're in Provincetown. The water's raising up. This entire neighborhood is flooded through one area, right? Again, this is way above the storm of record, but if you're planning into the future, this one neighborhood gets flooded by that one location. This neighborhood doesn't get flooded this way through the Provincetown Harbor. It gets flooded, it gets flooded there. What? Right? So these are the kinds of things you have to take into consideration. And we're talking about really, really small levels, right? We're like 6 inches of elevation. You could fix some of these things by increasing the crown of a road in some cases, right? There can be really simple solutions. We've worked with the National Park Service. The National Park Service has all these data. They have predictions for tide gauges. They have one in Provincetown Harbor, and I'm just going to show you this real quick. These are the storm tide pathways we did for the project. Again, we worked with the National Park Service to get them onto their website. They're updating this website now. It's a little different, but all those data there, you can go, you can zoom in really tight, and you can see where these storm tide pathways are, and you can also look at the predictions for the next high tide, the next 4 high tides. Towns like Provincetown and Truro have used these during storms to put sandbags, portable flood walls. They actually will use this the day of a storm, the day before the storm, to look at where they might allocate resources. And again, there's all that data. We created a website for storm. It's called stormtides.org. We use the National Weather Service's data for the real-time tides, and then we have our storm tide pathways. And again, I always like to show this image. This is the west end of Provincetown. That's 6 inches of water. Just 6 inches of water from this to that, right? From 13 to 13.5. And this is where, especially in places like Chatham and Orleans, where it's really flat and really low lying, a little bit of water, when we talk about feet of sea level rise, 6 inches of water can change a lot. All right, so let's get to the data. We have 105 storm tide pathways for Pleasant Bay. We mapped all these. They're throughout, obviously, throughout Pleasant Bay. We looked at all these. Again, we start at 9. This is mean low water. We go all the way up to 14. Storm of record is about 10.25 feet. So that's your storm of record. We do this in half-foot increments, right? So we have 105. For every 6 inches, and this is another acronym, TWL, total water level. This is just where that water is, right? This is what the National Weather Service uses. For every 6 inches of increase in total water level, you're averaging 40 acres of inundation. 40 acres of inundation for every 6 inches. I don't know what property values are around here, but 40 acres is a lot, right? So that's a big deal. We want to understand where that inundation is happening. Every 6 inches on average, you're losing about 40 acres are getting inundated. That's going to tie into the intertidal resources we talked about. We're going to talk about in a little bit. We broke it down by town, right? Chatham is the winner. But so you have verified and unverified. So I talked a little bit about that. Unverified means we couldn't get onto the spot with our GPS, which usually means it's private property, and we weren't going to go on private property. So they're located. We know they're there, but we recommend to the towns you got to work with people because we're not going to go on private property. Or we just couldn't get to them. Sometimes they were just places we couldn't get to. But they're there, the LiDAR says they're there, so they're worth further investigation. But most of them, 70% of them were, 68, 67% were verified. Okay, the storm of record, we talked about this a lot. We really like to look at this. The storm of record was January 2018. If you add just 6 inches to that storm of record, in this area, you're going to have 9 new storm-type pathways and 36.6 acres of inundation, just for 6 inches on that 2018 storm. So what does that mean? That means there are going to be 9 places that have never flooded before that will now flood. Never. No one's ever seen it because it's above the storm of record. Where are those places? Right? We need to know that. We need to understand them. That's what the study's doing. But there's going to be 36 acres of inundation now. This is what Greg was talking about, or part of what Greg was talking about. It's going to get inundated for about an hour or two, and then it's going to go away. A lot of towns, a lot of places are trying to plan in a way where there's floodable areas. It's okay for things to be flooded, because it's only going to be a couple hours, right? If you think about it. So sometimes it's okay. Like there are some places that can never be flooded, but there are some places that are. I mean, you really need to talk about and understand what those are and start to sort of figure out how we're going to do this. Same thing, 12 inches. So when you go just 1 foot above that storm of record, you got 13 new storm-type pathways in Pleasant Bay and 77 acres of inundation that had never occurred before with just 12 inches of sea level rise or water level increase. So with a slightly bigger storm, I mean, that storm wasn't that big in 2018. The storm surge was about 3 feet. We've seen storms with 4 feet of storm surge. Right? They're not that uncommon. So if all those things align, you're going to have a lot more inundation happening. Okay, just a couple figures to go through quick because we have a lot to go through. Just breaking them down by town, of course. Again, they're all color-coded, so the warm colors are the lower ones, and as you go up in water level, the colors get cooler. So those are the ones that are most concerning, are the warm colors, or the lowest. And then what we do is we look at total water level in acres. And the slope of this line gives you a sense of how much it's increasing as you go, as you increase water level, right? So you can see the acres here are in hundreds to thousands of acres inundated. Again, this is per 6 inches per foot. When you get to Harwich, there's fewer of them, and the acres are now tens of acres because it's just less area. Now, there's none in Brewster, but you can see that the ones in Orleans and the one in Harwich may impact areas in Brewster. So it's just something to think about. And then Orleans. There's a lot in Orleans. They're pretty spread out in Orleans. So we have these maps, we have these data, we have the map. Pleasant Bay Alliance has these data. When the project's over, well, the town can have the data, towns can have the data, and we can start working them up. You're going to see some, and we're working with Mike and Maeve and a bunch of different people to sort of better utilize these data now that we have the maps. All right, there's one for Orleans. So I'm just going to show you a couple quick ones, because again, this is that 6 inch thing. This is 10, 10 and a half to 11. So 6 inches, the road becomes unpassable and there's water flowing in here. And this is not uncommon in Chatham and in other places in Pleasant Bay. Same thing here. There's a major road going here. With just 6 inches of water, the road becomes unpassable. Now, there's 6 inches of water. Now, it's really important to understand, and we talked a lot with the fire and police departments when we're doing this kind of work. They're really interested in how much water is on the road, right? That's another use of these data. Yes, we can show you when the water's here, but if we know what the total water level is in real time, like if there was a tide gauge, and there is in Chatham Harbor, you can start to do the math, and you can start to figure out how much water is on that road. Because an inch or two of water, a little bit of water is still passable. Once you get to a certain amount, there's nothing going through there except emergency vehicles. And after a certain amount, even emergency vehicles aren't going to go through there. And the key is, and Provincetown found this out the hard way, it's salt water. You drive through salt water, they lost a fire truck in Provincetown because of that. Now, they had to go to an emergency situation, but they lost a fire truck. It's a lot of money. So you just have to prepare for these things and understand them. And you can start to figure out alternate routes. Right now, Steve McGee is working with the fire chief, the police chief in Eastham to look at reverse 911, using these data in reverse 911. Okay, there's an event. There's a text or a phone call that goes out to everybody in this neighborhood. Don't use this road, use this road. That's simple. It could be that simple. So we're now taking these data. Once you have a map, you can do things with it, right? And we're understanding different ways of using these maps. So that's a really interesting one that we hadn't even thought of. There's jackknife. We talked about this before. Carol mentioned this. Same kind of thing. This is another one of those things. So at a very low level, obviously, this road gets flooded here. But what's interesting here is this little area here. Again, the water floods from the back. Does it flood from the front or floods from the back? So there's all these little pieces that you can start to put together with these maps that you can understand. A quick little piece about intertidal resources. So Carol mentioned this before. We did a study where we used a slightly more conservative sea level rise curve, right? We used we all agreed to use a different sea level rise curve. It's a little higher this time. So in the current data, we have 400 acres of intertidal resources in Pleasant Bay. By 2050, it's 247, right? You lose 167 acres. It's about 40% loss just by 2050 using this, and this is the intermediate, I think, intermediate high or intermediate? I think it's intermediate. So it's not even the worst case scenario. By 2100, you're down to 117. You've lost 72% of your intertidal resources. Now, how does this play out? Well, I mean, just looking at the numbers, if you start to crunch the numbers by year, this is impressive. 5 acres every year, right? By 2100, it goes down a little, and we'll talk about why. And then the overall average for the time period that we looked at, from the current data, the present to 2100, is about 3.7 acres per year. Now, why do these vary? Because it's not a bathtub, right? So here's one place here. We're going to show you 4 figures. This is figure A. The green is what's here. The green is when we map intertidal resources today. This is the intertidal resource today. The yellow is what's going to happen in 2040. So a lot of it's going away here, right? But even more goes away in 2100. So this is an area where you have a certain amount and it keeps getting smaller with each time period, right? Same thing here, but there are new areas that are gaining. You're gaining, these places where this is the extent of the intertidal here, the green, and then you're gaining some as it gets inundated, as the sea level rise. So you're actually gaining in places, losing in others. Same thing here, big loss in green, but this is all captured. Now, this is all hypothetical. Whether we're going to let the water inundate these areas is a whole nother thing. But this is why you make these maps. You make these maps to start making these judgment calls and understanding what's going to happen. This yellow area is not intertidal right now, right? But it will be by 2050 based on these projections. Oop, did it again. And this is an area where you have a lot of gain, right? So you have this little bit of intertidal area here, and then you get all of this in 2050, but then it goes away, and then you have all this in 2100. So if you go throughout Pleasant Bay, it's different in different places. So you have to look at the maps and look at the data, and you can start to piece together. And this is where the scientists give it to the engineers. The engineers got to figure this stuff out. These are the guys who really do stuff. We just kind of, look at maps and make, do some analysis. But the real hard work comes when the engineers have to come in and say, all right, what are we actually going to do here? Right, that's the hard part. That's why I'm a scientist. All right. Now, the fun part for me, the Barrier Beach stuff. This is the pure, really looking at what's going on with the Barrier Beach, because this is where the action is. This is where, if you have a problem in the Barrier Beach, everything changes, right? So, I got about, what am I, about 5, 10 minutes? Yeah, okay. So I don't have to rush through this, that's good. All right, but I will try and talk a little slower. I'm getting excited now. Yeah, so take more coffee. Yeah, good idea. All right. All right, so this is our Barrier Beach, Pleasant Bay, right? So we're going to look at, we did 2 different kinds of analysis. We looked at the data that are already out there, terrestrial LiDAR data that we mentioned before, went back to 2014 to the present. The latest they have is 2021. And then we went out and flew our drone twice. We went out in the fall of last year and the spring of 2023, and we're going to fly out. We're going to go again any day now. Literally, we're going to go in October, November to get that fall survey. So we're going to have 3 surveys. That way you get away from just looking at seasonality, which we'll talk about. The longer data set you have, the more you can say about a system. So, but looking at the data that's out there, it's really interesting stuff. So what we're going to do, and we're going to walk through these data. I don't expect you to look at this and get a lot of detail out of it, but we're going to break it all down into pieces. Basically, when there's erosion, there's red, right? When there's deposition, it's blue, right? So the cooler colors are deposition, the warmer colors are erosion. Now again, we're going to break this down as we go through this. We're going to remove the image, and we're going to zoom in on this. So it's just going to take time, and we're going to walk through it. Here we go. So we're going to break it down into chunks. We're going to look at the top chunk first, right? This is our image, and this is the surface difference. This is the difference between 2014 and 2021, right? If there's been deposition in that time, they're cooler colors, right? If there's been erosion from 2014 to 2021, it's red, it's warmer colors. So what do we have here? We have cooler colors here. You got some deposition here. You got erosion all along here, but you got this deposition. Washover fan. What's happening? This is a low-lying area. Storms are coming in, elevated water, and bring sand with it, right? As the sand washes over the barrier gets higher in elevation, right? That's really good. This is how barriers keep pace with sea level rise. It is really, really important. If your barrier is not doing this, you have a problem. Anybody ever been to Louisiana? Because they have a problem. Their barriers are not doing this, right? This is really good. So when you see erosion here, well, you have erosion on the open ocean beach. Surprise, surprise. You're going to have erosion on the open ocean beach. What you want to know is what's happening back here, right? So this is a very good sign for this particular area. Same thing here, lots of washover, lots of cool colors, and you don't have, this is okay. You've got some deposition during this time here. And here, just at the southern tip, you do have some erosion. You don't have any washover here, but it's pretty wide. So that's not that bad. It's pretty wide. You got salt marsh behind it. That's not too bad. You can see here now, like you see more detail. Once we get rid of the picture, you can see this really clearly. This washover fan, nice little washover fan here. And you've got this area that's not having much net erosion during this time. And it's just 2 snapshots, right? It's one in 2014 and one in 2021. Okay, now we go down to the central piece here. That's our little location map. Do the same thing. We show it over the aerial photograph first. Erosion, erosion, erosion. Not that much deposition here as before, but this has already been deposited. This is already a washover fan that happened decades and decades ago. So much so that the salt marsh is growing on top of it, right? So every time the ocean water comes in and flows in here, and this is underwater, sediment flows down into the salt marsh and it captures that material and it's keeping pace with sea level rise. Now, Steve Smith and the Cape Cod National Seashore do a lot of work in Pleasant Bay in terms of looking at salt marshes and how they're keeping pace with sea level rise, and it can be very variable. And I don't want to put Steve on the hook. I'm not going to put Sophia on the hook. I'm trying not to look at her. But I don't know how they're doing, and off the top of my head, I think Pleasant Bay is doing okay. It's not doing great. It's not doing, but I think there are lots of parts of it that are okay. There are other places in the seashore that aren't. But I think Pleasant Bay is doing pretty good. But this is what you want to see. It's a big salt marsh, and it's really wide, and you're okay here. And then if you see it without the image, the colors pop a little more, and you get a little more understanding of what's going on. And then the last one, you're near the inlet here, right? So everything's really dynamic here, but you have a lot of washover here. You see this little jog in the shoreline? That's unusual, right? Nature works to straighten out a shoreline. So there's a lot of action going on right here. And this is where you would keep, you'd want to pay attention. There's a lot of erosion here, but look what's right behind it. There's a lot of deposition. There's a big washover fan there. So again, this is how barriers keep pace with sea level rise. They erode on the ocean side, and they wash over, they get higher, and then they deposit on the back barrier side. And they slowly, the geologic form moves landward as sea level rises. That's a healthy barrier. That's a good thing, right? That's important to know. If it were just getting narrower and narrower and narrower, you'd have a problem. Because eventually it's going to, you're going to have an inlet, it's going to breach, and then you have a whole nother thing. This barrier, looking at the data we've seen over this time period, is pretty healthy. Lots of it, most of it, is just sort of eroding on the ocean side, building up in elevation on the barrier itself, and then depositing in some places on the back barrier side, just like that. That's what you want to see, right? That's really nice. See this washover fan? It's a low area, and it's just washing over, and the landform is moving, toward the mainland. So now we're going to look at, again, the 2014. There was aerial photographs with the LiDAR too, with those dates, 2014 and 2021. So we see an image from 2014, and then we look at 21. So now I'm going to go back and forth, and I'm going to call your attention to a couple things. So what you want to do is you want to look at these channels. So this is clearly underwater, right? At high tide, these probably are underwater or close to being underwater. So what's happening here is it's building up. There's more sand moving this way, and it's actually getting higher. It's actually getting higher in elevation, and we can do that. It's hard to see just with the aerial photographs, but we can do that thing we showed with stone-type pathways, where we can cut a transect, a profile through these data sets, and you can look at how much accretion has happened here. It would be tricky just to look at this image and spot that, right? But when we measure it, we see a lot. And this is kind of washed out here. These are meters. So that's 3, 4, 5 feet of dune growth right here. So it's getting higher. As the dune gets higher, it's harder to overwash, right? So there's less erosion that goes on, and when the erosion does happen, it's slowing down because it's got to now eat up that dune also. Another good thing that barriers do. 2014, this whole area here, keep an eye up there, just getting filled with sand. This area here, oops, sorry, went too far. Yeah, filled with sand. That's a lot of sand. Again, it's washing over during a storm, very likely, washing over during a storm and getting the elevations going up. That's the key. Sea level's rising. If the land level rises, we're okay, right? As far as these barriers are concerned. If the barrier is keeping pace with sea level rise, it's much, much better. And again, we do the same kind of, went the wrong way, sorry. Same kind of thing, not much change, a lot of change. That's the growth that we're seeing here, right? Do a little transect here. And then this is just a bit of erosion here. In 7, 8 years, not that surprising. A house, it's always good to have things out there that give you some kind of reference. I don't really have to say anything, do I? But we do a profile right here. There's a lot there. There's a lot of change. Between 2014 and 2022, that's a lot of change. Now, what's happening here, a good thing to point out, there's barely any change behind here. This is not washing over. This is not increasing with sea level rise. Why? Because this has to go, this is one of those odd things. The dune that you build up to protect, like that stored sand, it has to go away first. It has to be eroded first so the water can wash over. Right? It's a natural cycle for barrier islands. It's really, really cool. You have these big, high dunes, but eventually they get eroded. Once they get eroded, now you can have that wash over. Now the water can flow during a storm to the back of the barrier and deposit sand right here. There's no way water's getting over this dune. Water can get over this now. Well, that's the house, though. Oh, no, sorry, this is the house. That's the house. But water can start to get over this now. So as this dune keeps getting eroded and eroded and eroded, water can flow over, and the barrier will migrate landward, hopefully. One more with the house. Really sharp contrast in terms of what's going on out here, an erosional scarp. Again, perfectly normal, but that's just getting more and more beat up. It's migrating. This form, the beach side, is migrating landward. It just went like this, but the backside didn't. Right? Because the dune is too high. Once the dune gets around here, it'll start to wash over. Sand will get deposited on the salt marsh, and hopefully it just keeps going eastward. So this is all normal. It's all good. So now we get to the drone data. You don't have too much. I don't want to show because I just wanted to show how we do this. So this is the same house here. So now we're doing it like 6 months apart, right? We're doing it in the fall of 22 and the spring of 2023. This is an image from the drone. This is an image that we captured with the drone. It flies around 400 feet in the air, and this is a surface. So we create a surface with the drone. And I don't know if you can see this here. These are tire tracks. And if you can't see it on here, you can see footprints. You can see footprints in the surface. Come on, that's really good. You can see the footprints in the sand. You can see footprints in the surface that we create. That's the kind of resolution we're talking about. That's really cool. And it's absolute positioning. We can come back next year, and we have, and looked at change. Right? So this is that seasonal change. So we looked at 2014 to 2021, and we looked at that change. Now we're looking at seasonal change. Tip of the house, dune, the little low spot in front of it, the dune. Now this is probably just vegetation growing, right? Because the dune picks up the top of the vegetation. So this probably doesn't change much, but this is classic spring beach and fall beach, right? Nice, big, wide summer beach that you're sitting on, and it's much higher. And then in the fall, it looks like that. So now we're looking at the annual changes. We're looking at seasonal changes. We want to understand what's typically happening out there, what we can expect, and how the barrier is doing over the long term. We're going to go out again, and we're going to have a spring or a fall 2023. So we'll have an annual shot at this and see what it's looking like, right? And that's all part of this project. So we think that's really important, and we're looking forward to doing it. And I think this is, so the question of overall barrier health, I've kind of addressed this before. It's in pretty good shape. All things being equal, it's in pretty good shape. Notice I didn't talk about this barrier. Ted Keon just sat down. That's good. Not talking about the health of that one. Just talking about Pleasant Bay. But yeah, so now that's all I have, and happy to answer questions.
Excellent. Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Mark and Greg. So We have a microphone. I think Kristen's back there. Thank you, Kristen. So any questions for Mark or Greg? I think this.
Are these data that you
Could you, excuse me, ma'am, could you just use the mic? Thanks.
are these data available to the public? Can I go on stormtides.org and find my home and really zone in?
So, this is on? So we have the data, the town can have the data. We haven't put it on stormtide.org because that wasn't part of the project. So the project wasn't to post the data up online. We could do that at some point in the future. We absolutely could. But we don't have it there. But the town will have the data. So the answer is yes and no. Yes, you can look at the data if you go to the town. We don't have it on stormtides.org yet, but we could.
I think in terms of public education, being able to overlay some of what you've shown
Yep.
onto a particular neighborhood or neighborhoods would
Yep.
really bring home the.
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that. There are pros and cons to showing flooding in the future on private property. But I just want to be clear, these are not our data, right? We're just going out in the field and we're making maps. We're not making projections. We don't have probabilities. We're not projecting when it's going to happen. We're just making a map. So, yeah. But all of the data we make are public and available to anybody who wants them. The stormtide.org thing just makes it much easier. It's like using Google Earth, right? It's much simpler.
Hello. What's happening inside?
It's happening.
Inside the bay. We're looking at the barrier,
Oh, yeah.
but what about the flooding and just talk about it, not specifically. Is the flooding more prominent? Is it what's happening inside?
Yeah, so inside is trickier because of the inlets, right? So we are doing a study we've been doing a study since 2007, looking at the water levels at the fish pier, at Meeting House Pond, and other places in Pleasant Bay, and it looks like it has to do with how much flow is going through the inlet. So the tide range is getting smaller in Pleasant Bay right now, but not by much, but by a little. So the higher tides aren't as high as they used to be, and low tides are similar, if I'm remembering the last version of the report. So it's a good thing in some respects because the high tide's a little lower, but it's not much. We're talking about less than half a foot difference. So there'll be less impacts to ring a storm, but the water quality is going to diminish a little if there's not as much flushing. But I'm not the author on that paper, so in general, not much has changed over the course of the report that we've done or the work that we've done here in terms of the inner shoreline. It's all about the inlets for the inner shoreline. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, please. Oh, I said it backwards. So the low tide is rising and the high tide. Okay.
No, well,
You better just tell me, Ted.
Get up here, Ted.
the high tides are still getting in because once it gets over the shoals and so forth, the water flows in, and the high tides have been relatively similar. It's the low tides that aren't being able to get out because of the shoaling into the inner system.
Okay.
So the tide range is decreasing, but the high tides have been more or less similar.
Okay.
The low tides are getting a little bit higher because it can't get out the inlets because there's so much shoaling.
Okay. So the tide range is decreasing, but not the high tides getting lower. Okay, got it.
The inside tides are still more or less similar to the outside ocean.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah, that's Graham Geis's study, but. Yep.
Apologize if you already. I had to step out for a sec, so maybe
Okay.
you already answered this question.
You get your hands full.
Your inundation models were about storm tide pathways, but it
Yes.
seems like groundwater comes up, and not only that, but groundwater comes up through all kinds of things like storm water drains and what have you. So does your model take into account that in terms of where the water shows up and how it flows?
Excellent point. Every time I do this talk, I get that question because it's really important. I get either precipitation or groundwater. And again, we're not doing a model at all, right? There's no model. What we're saying is when the water gets to this elevation, there'll be water flowing there. So it could be groundwater, it could be related to precipitation. And yeah, as sea level rise increases, it's going to change the water table, right? People know that. That fresh water is less dense than salt water, right? So as salt water inundates and more salt water gets at the subsurface, the water table gets higher, right? And that can push water up and it can cause what you're saying. For the most part, during storm events, it's the salt water that's causing a problem. But sometimes it doesn't have a place to go if the fresh water is rising. So it can exacerbate the problem. But what we're doing, the mapping we're doing, doesn't take into account where the different water sources are coming from. Whether it's sea level rise, storm surge, groundwater, precipitation. We tried to make this as simple as possible and eliminate all the other variables, which brings down the uncertainty. Right? That's a big thing for us. We want to make this, bring down as much uncertainty as we can. So trying to figure out where all those different sources of water are coming from is a whole nother thing. But important, but not what we're doing here. And, yeah.
And I think that raises a good point too, that a lot of the projections and looks at where flooding is going to be is mostly based on coastal flooding, right? So it may not take into account precipitation. And we've certainly experienced some rather intense precipitation events lately. We're getting a lot more punctuated storms, a lot more intense rainfall. And so that's certainly going to add to the overall water during a coastal storm. That said, I think that's going to be very localized. Like the ocean coming in usually overshadows any precipitation unless you're right near a river, which we don't really have large rivers on Cape Cod, Pleasant Bay, but you can certainly get some localized storm flow into an area that's going to make the flooding worse. And that's not necessarily included in a lot of these models.
Thanks so much for this presentation, and maybe because it's a Saturday and Greg mentioned we don't want to go to Louisiana, but it causes me to think, because we have such good data, people that are knowledgeable, both homeowners asking questions about how do I respond, to think of the future that we're looking at on the earth. And that's the whole reason why folks are so motivated about climate change, but the hesitation that you heard about sharing that house-specific data raises a whole set of issues on socioeconomic issues across the world. So we are doing things locally, but we are going to be affected by this in such ways that we have no idea yet. Relocation of people, populations, it just, thanks for doing this, but it has made me think, that's for sure.
Sure, and maybe just tying into that a little bit. So I work with the Sea Grant program. We have programs in all the coastal states, and every community, every county, every state has different political and views about how they want to share. And sorry about that. So there are some of my colleagues who work in just town level communities where they have very specific requirements upon the sale of a home, where they are literally forced to share the erosion rates and flood maps for these particular areas. So it's not saying that, we're not saying you have to do that, but there are some communities that look towards that public information that may actually depreciate the value of a home, just in full and transparency for people coming in who may not know the area.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Stand back. Thank you very much, Mark and Greg, and excellent questions. So now we've had a chance to get a picture of, a primer on sea level rise and how that might affect our inner shoreline resources as well as the barrier beach. Now we're going to sort of zoom in on some specific resilience topics that we've been studying in our next segment. So I'd like to start by introducing Mike Giggy, Senior Vice President, and Maeve Carlson, Project Engineer with Wright Pierce, who are going to talk with us about public access and water protection infrastructure.
Thanks, Carol. Good morning to everybody. And Mark, I like the transition you provided there between science and engineering. The scientists tell us that we are in the midst of a problem that's going to get worse, and we engineers have to try to figure out what we're going to do about it. So Wright Pierce is a member of the project team. Maeve and I are representing the firm on this project. We're going to talk to you today about the case studies that we're establishing to look at the specifics. We're going to set forth a framework or template that the towns can use to judge the degree of vulnerability, but also what solutions make the most sense. Maeve's going to take you through the 8 sites so you can see exactly what we're looking at. And we're going to talk at the end about some options for increasing resilience, not just the technical aspect of it, but the management aspect. So the MVP grant includes a specific scope that has us look at these 4 types of municipal infrastructure: access to the bay, boat ramps, piers, etc. 2, stormwater facilities. 3, wastewater infrastructure, sewers. And the 4th, the water distribution system. So in the beginning, we decided, let's focus, make sure we're under focus here. So we specifically decided not to look at low-lying roadways, and the Cape Cod Commission is undertaking a study on that subject, so we're trying to interface there but not overlap. We're specifically not looking at Mass DOT facilities, Route 28, because it's not municipal, but also a whole different set of circumstances. The public water supply wells are in pretty good shape. The wells and the treatment systems, they're largely inland, so we've decided to exclude those from this study. And we're certainly not looking at private infrastructure, docks, revetments, septic systems, et cetera. So an interesting first step was to do an inventory, and we found 65 locations of public infrastructure in those 4 categories. So that in itself was a helpful exercise. About 30 of those sites are related to public access. 3 town beaches and 27 sites of access, even down to pedestrian access. We found 25 stormwater outfalls in the watershed, municipally owned, quite a bit more if you include Mass DOT. But only 2 of those we found with stormwater best management practices, so we're homing in on those. So the goal was to get to 8 case studies. We started with 65 locations. We shortlisted to 17, got town input to make sure we were on the right track, and we're here today to talk to you about those 8. And in getting to the 8, we wanted to make sure we had 1 in each town. We wanted to have at least 1 of each type of infrastructure. We're looking to have sites and projects that are applicable across the entire watershed. So even though there's 65 places, we're looking at 8, but we want the 8 to be representative. And we're looking at a broad range of options for enhancing reliability, with a goal of not just looking at these 8 sites, but expanding those so towns can use the data at other sites as well. So here's the results. This map shows the entire bay. There are 17 individual yellow dots. Those are the 17 shortlisted sites. And those with a circle around the dot are the ones that we're going to talk about in detail here. So you can see we certainly got the geographic range covered. We've got 3 sites in Orleans, 1 in Brewster, a couple in Harwich, and 2 town landings in Chatham. Maybe we'll show you pictures of each, but one thing of interest is 5 of these sites are on the open bay, but 3 of them are what I call headwaters locations. Meeting House Pond in Orleans, Lonnie's Pond, where there's an interesting stormwater system, and then the lowest piece of wastewater infrastructure in the region, the Hardin Lane pump station that's at the headwaters of Muddy Creek. Okay, let me interject this now. The important fact here is that the framework or the template that we've established, and I know I'm on the edge of elevation overload here, but bear with me. So we're trying to come up with a framework for public education and also for analysis. And we're looking in the vertical part of this slide of water elevation. And Greg has already shown you the typical twice a day, high tide, low tide that's shown in the left-hand portion here, plus 2.3 feet at high tide, minus 2.3 feet at low tide, with mean tide being at 0. And the spring tide is shown here too. And in perspective, see that storm of record at the northeaster of 2018, up almost 8 feet, about a 3.5-foot surge over the spring tide at that time. So that's where we are today, but part of this is looking into the future. So if we go out to the year 2050, roughly 25 years hence, here's the same day in and day out tidal fluctuation, but just 2.5 feet higher. And if we go out to 2070, 45 years hence, you can see that we're up to a 4.2-foot baseline elevation. So the mean tide elevation at that point is, we're predicting it to be roughly comparable to the spring tide today. So that puts things in perspective as the challenges we're faced with. We're looking at 2050 because it's 25 years out, 2070 is 45, and thinking about wastewater and water supply infrastructure probably ought to have a 45 or 50-year design life. And what's not shown in this chart is the future storm surges that take you way off the sheet, up to 15 feet or more. So this is the framework, and this is an important output of our project. So this framework applies to all the sites around the bay, and it's going to be a valuable tool to use to judge vulnerability today, but also plan for the elevations we need to meet in the future.
Thanks so much, Mike. So you guys have been such troopers today, listening through a lot of the data. So hopefully now I'll talk about something that is a little bit easier to digest, which is the locations across a lot of your towns. So we're going to go through each of the 8 sites that we've selected to be part of this study. And the first one is the Meeting House Pond Town Landing, which is located off of Barley Neck Road in Orleans. You'll know that the town landing provides access to Meeting House Pond, and it has a boat ramp as well as a boat storage area, which you can see here with the little dinghies. And that also has a wooden pier that leads down to a floating dock that was installed in about 2010, I believe. And it has some new stormwater infrastructure that's buried on site that was installed in 2019, along with some additional parking improvements. You can see that some of the elevations here are quite low, including portions of the actual pier. So not the whole pier is floating, just that last little bit. So there's a long walkway that's about elevation 5. And we'll take a closer look at this site as one of the examples I'll dig into in a little bit more detail at the end. So the second site is what Mike just mentioned, Lonnie's Pond. And so this is a site that has multiple different types of infrastructure. It's located in Orleans, accessed by Herringbrook Way, which is a road that has been identified by that Cape Cod study as being one of the low-lying roads that is frequently inundated under those future storm scenarios. So just kind of tying those two studies together, this is an area of interest in that study as well. And so this site has a town landing as well, roadside stormwater treatment, which you can see in those kind of barrels. They're called storm treat systems, and they're rather old at this point. Then there's also the herring run that connects from Lonnie's Pond to the upstream Pilgrim Lake, which is a really important spawning ground for that species. You'll see if you go by that the stormwater infrastructure here and also the channel is aging, and the town already has plans underway to revive those infrastructure components and kind of make an additional project here already that's being planned. Site 3 is a water main that's located on the bottom of Tarkiln Bridge. And so this is a Mass DOT-owned bridge that goes along Route 28 that goes over Tarkiln Stream. And so the pipe that's nestled underneath is a public utility. It's a 12-inch water main that we believe was original to the 1960s. However, the attachments to that bridge just got redone by Wright Pierce in 2021. And so those are solid at this point, but they definitely needed a little bit of work to kind of make sure that they were properly attached to the underside of that bridge. And the water main is actually nestled up in what's called a utility bay, so it's not like hanging down below the bridge with things that could potentially knock into it. But it is still potentially at risk if the water was to come up and actually flood to that bridge deck level. The water main could also be impacted. So site 4, this is some water mains that are buried, so just in the ground, but these are located in Brewster near Tar Kiln Road. So that is an area of low-lying land that we believe in the initial analysis we looked and saw, okay, this is really low-lying infrastructure. There's some fire hydrants here. Let's look at the risk of potentially cutting off access for public emergency vehicles to be able to access these water mains if this area was to flood. Thankfully, the secondary kind of in-depth analysis showed that those hydrant elevations are up a steep embankment, and so they're not as much of at risk, but there is still water main that is down in the ground there. And so, you know, somebody asked a great question about saltwater intrusion, and as that water table rises, what the effects are. If you've got a ferric pipe or a metal pipe, and you've got saltwater interacting with that more frequently, that can reduce the lifetime of that pipe, and so that was something else that we considered here. Very similarly, there's a water main that the town of Harwich owns and maintains that's located in another low-lying area. This is right on the coast, and that's at the intersection of Bay Road and Route 28. So you can see that at this location, it's quite low elevation. It varies from, you know, about 2 feet is where we think the pipe is probably most likely down in the ground. And so this is definitely inundated already. There's been, you know, water that comes up to this beach that's right adjacent, so there's likely water in the ground there already. And then also the fire hydrants along this stretch are lower than at the last location, so they're around elevation 10. So we wanted to look at this location for emergency access to those. And then this is the second site that we're going to take a deeper look at in a minute. This is the pump station, the wastewater pump station on Hardin Lane that Harwich maintains. It's a relatively small station. It serves about 6 houses along the road, and it was constructed in 2021. It's at the end of a little cul-de-sac. So I'll return to this one in a minute. And then we've got 2 kind of more exposed public access points to Pleasant Bay. The first one is Crow's Pond Landing in Chatham. And so this is a town-owned boat ramp. It's located off of Fox Hill Road in Chatham, and it consists of a concrete ramp that we believe was installed in about 1989. And so it's a pretty shallow ramp that goes down with riprap embankments. And there's an unpaved parking area nearby, also a little bit of boat storage, but mostly it's kind of an open area for people to launch boats and access the water. But you'll see that the ramp is located at a really low elevation of actually -1 compared to mean sea level. It goes down into the water up to about elevation 3, and this already gets flooded, you know, during high tides very frequently. And it's kind of built to be able to withstand that, but obviously when we're looking into the future, this wouldn't be super useful if it was underwater all the time. And then our final site, this is the Cowyard Landing, which is also in Chatham, and it's another boat ramp located off of Cowyard Lane. Similar to the last one, this area is small. It's just a gravel and sand boat launch area. It doesn't have any paved areas, and so cars park along one side of the road. Some boats are also stored along this beach, but similarly, this area also already floods. You'll see that it goes from about elevation 0 to 9, so it goes up a little bit higher, but it's certainly down there at a low elevation. So that's just a quick introduction to the 8 sites. And then, you know, when we're talking about the summary of uses here, as Mike mentioned, we were really trying to take a look at all the different types of infrastructure so that these sites and also this method can be applied to other infrastructure in your community, whether that be even a private house that you want to kind of think through the same framework, or if a town wants to use it for new infrastructure that they're putting in, or look at other areas identified in the storm tide pathway analysis. So just quickly going through these again, for water access, we've got boat launches, piers, also parking, just for folks to kind of go down and access the water. And then we have a whole bunch of utilities, including wastewater conveyance, stormwater treatment, water distribution. And then these sites also serve kind of a secondary purpose in a lot of ways of preventing erosion and sand migration, and also providing habitat connectivity. So like think about that Lonnie's Pond example, you know, of the herring run. And then just briefly talking about the risks, the first one would be limited access to that water, both permanent and also potentially temporary. So a tidal variation, if it's a huge storm event, you're probably not going to try to launch your boat anyway, so maybe that's okay. But if this is going to be constantly inundated, then that use of the site is now disrupted. Also potential damage and encroachment to storage or parking areas. And then when we're talking about utilities, it can run the whole gamut of water, stormwater, wastewater. And obviously these provide services to us as users, but it also protects the environment. If there's a wastewater discharge that's overflowing into the environment, or stormwater that's supposed to be treated that's now just going directly into the bay, that's not ideal. And then finally, I mentioned it, these sites also have impacts for emergency vehicles, both for parking to be able to get down there and actually help someone in an emergency, and also for fire hydrant accessibility. So these are the things that we are all kind of looking at, and that will be summarized in our final reports to basically say, these are the things that we're thinking about if these sites were to be impacted. And then just really quickly going to go through the kind of more in-depth look at two of these sites. So the first one is going back to Meeting House Pond. And so first, when you look here, the image on the left is the one that you've seen a couple times now. So looking at the elevation, and we have a bunch of different colored bars. That might be a little bit difficult with this glare, but those correspond with shaded areas on that site figure to show you where the boat ramp is, where the parking area is, where these different elevations are actually physically on site. And so you can see that during the year 2050, on the right side of that graph, there's under 2.5 feet of sea level rise. The pier could be flooding almost every day or every day. So that would be, the elevation 5 is right up to that elevation where you're seeing the normal tidal cycle impacting that area. And then if you were to look at the MCRFRM model, which Greg introduced, and again, this is a conservative model that looks at the 100-year storm scenario under a high sea level rise. For gray infrastructure, we have a lower risk tolerance, so we're looking at one of those higher projections. But if you look at the storm surge, that's the two bars at the top of the screen are what you're seeing, which is up around elevation 14. So the water surface elevation is 12.6 and the design flood elevation is 15.6. And you can see the lines on that site over there in blue, if I can get this thing to work. These are where that would actually come up on the site based on the elevation LiDAR we have. And so this is an example of a site where, again, if it's a 1 in every 10 or 20 year storm, you're not going to be trying to use this site. However, if it's something that's inundated frequently, you're not going to be able to have the function most of the time. And so Mike and I's job is really to try to interpret the data that we're getting and try to pass it along to the town so you can make an intelligent decision about the use of the site, what's acceptable risk, and what's not. And then finally, before I pass it back to Mike, just wanted to give another example. This is the pump station again in Harwich. And this is a different example where we just saw that the site's functionality was disrupted in these long-term planning horizons. On a different note, the wastewater pump station here is an example of a site where there are some impacts, but the functionality is likely to remain good over the next 50 years. So this is looking out to 2070. And so the top of the wet well, which is where the water could potentially come in and interact with the wastewater, and the other wastewater components were designed in a way where the elevation was 3 feet above the FEMA 100-year base flood elevation. And so that's what this red line is looking across here. And so it was 11, and so they built it at elevation 14. And if you look, you're like, oh my gosh, that's so much higher than all of this stuff. Why would they do that? That's a really helpful design tool, and that's actually part of wastewater design standards. So what that means is then when you look at these higher storm scenarios, it doesn't show up on my little graph, but this is at elevation 13.9 and 14.6. I'm not sure why it doesn't come up here, but that's right up here. And so what you're seeing is that because they were proactive and designed it to be so high and conservative, even when we look at this 1 in 100-year storm 50 years from now under a pretty high risk scenario, you're still basically being able to be protected and to maintain the functionality of that infrastructure. So this is an example of something that is proactively planning, and that's what we'd like to see for all of these different types of sites across the towns. So again, this is just example of 2 sites. Our final report will have this information a lot more, including some of the storm tide pathways, but for all of the 8 sites.
So we're 1 year into the 2-year study. We've done a good inventory of the assets in these categories. We've got detailed data on each of them. We looked at what the uses are. We've taken advantage of the data the scientists have provided on elevations today and into the future. And so our next step is to start to look, how can we enhance resilience at these sites? How can we harden them? And this shows some of the things we're now looking at. Hardening the stations in place, raising facilities to get more protection, looking at relocating functions on site or at new sites. And we're also starting to look at procedures, the non-structural aspects, emergency evacuation plans and cleanup plans, et cetera. We hope later on today to talk in some depth about what towns are going to do with this information. And here's some philosophies a town might take. Certainly, every town should design new facilities and locate new facilities, keeping in mind this data. That's easy. Now, towns may find assets and uses that are so important that, given the likelihood of sea level rise, they're going to make a change now. They're going to put it in next year's capital plan, and that's a good idea. A more measured approach would be to wait, keep track of the design life of each of these assets, and be ready when the design life is over to replace the asset with higher or strengthened facilities. And then there's the tight-fisted Yankee approach. Don't fix it if it ain't broke. You could, wait until something has actually been destroyed and then replace it. And to the extent you're going to look at new sites, because existing ones like maybe the Crow's Pond Landing or in jeopardy, be thinking about obtaining the land or the rights to the land now, and maybe later on doing the actual change. So these are all different approaches. The approaches that towns are going to take are based on the approach of that town and the location and the assets, but keep all of that in mind. This is a nice chart. I really like this. Shows a lot of things. But don't be overly comforted. There's a lot of uncertainty, and then you're certainly going to go home today with that thought about how uncertain the data are. We don't know for sure how resilient existing facilities are. They were designed for standards, but they're old, and how resilient are they? Might we see the storm of record, or a worse storm of record today, with no sea level rise? We need to be prepared for that eventuality. And the blue lines show the normal, what I call blue sky data. No storm, but this is what happens. So how sure are we that in 45 years the curve's actually going to look like that? I think it's going to look like that day to day, but just where is it going to be? We're not sure. We don't know. We know it's going to be up there. The storm of record occurred at a spring tide, unfortunately, but the same storm might occur at low tide and be much less damaging. So we have to take into account that uncertainty. And at the municipal level, how dire must the circumstances be before town's going to want to spend money? That's another point of uncertainty. It varies town to town. So the answer to all this, in my mind, is adaptive management. You deal with uncertainty by having a phased program, and you stand ready to implement the program as conditions warrant. You have built-in points of mid-course correction, and over time you've accomplished the goals as the needs evolve and as money is available. So take home adaptive management is a key message today. Now, each and every town should have coastal resilience as a line item in their capital plan. You all do, yes? Sure. Let's reinforce that. Let's make sure that money's being spent with a methodical plan. And assets that we've identified should be prioritized as to their value. There should be budgets established. There should be contingency funds set up, because be prepared for the things you're not prepared for. Know that unexpected events occur. And certainly things you can do now is start to develop those protocols. Should the Hardin Lane pump station be inaccessible for some extreme storm, we'll have a plan ready to call Bobby Hour and pump out the wet well as needed. So those are all things to worry about. Now, I said in the beginning we want to pick sites and uses and activities that can be extrapolated across the entire watershed. So we've established a storm of record that everybody can be concerned about. We've looked at elevation changes that are expected through 2 different milestones in the future, and we've distinguished between the blue sky activities and the storm surges. So that's a very valuable framework that I'd urge all the towns to adopt as they look at other sites. We will have a suite of resiliency measures that is intended to be as broad as possible, so towns can look at other sites that they're responsible for and adapt their own, pick from that menu of options. And I'm pretty pleased that the way the wastewater part of this is working out. Hardin Lane looks like it was well-designed, appropriately located. Good job. Did I see Alan here? Yeah. Hey. But realized that in the course of the study of this information, I got on the phone with the engineer designing Orleans' sewer system to make sure that pump station number 4, part of the Meeting House Pond project, that's now, it's underway. And indeed, we confirmed that is appropriately elevated. And the Meeting House Pond project in New Orleans will have grinder pumps in the backyards of many homes around the pond. So we've been talking about design standards for those privately owned pieces of infrastructure. They'll connect to the public system. So that's working. And sure enough, Chatham someday wants to build a wastewater pumping station on Fox Hill Road near Crows Pond Landing. Well, that's where one of the storm tide pathways that Mark showed, that's the real challenge. So we've, again, set forth the framework to start looking at that future infrastructure as well. Here's the Wright Pierce report that's been issued in June, linked accordingly to the Pleasant Bay website. Have a look at it. We'll be issuing a further report as we complete the 2nd year of our study.
Thank you, Mike and Maeve. So now we have a very thorough kind of framework for thinking about our public access and water protection infrastructure. We're going to shift gears a little bit and start a little bit of focus on natural resources within the system, and starting with salt marsh restoration and resilience. And welcome, Sophia Fox, ecologist with the Cape Cod National Seashore.
Thank you, everyone. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and start talking about our natural resources. Unfortunately, we still have to talk about elevations and sea level rise, so stay with us. So I think you guys are noticing how it's all sort of coming together from Greg's start through Mike, and hopefully this will continue with the thread that you've already seen. I'm going to be talking about our marshes, and as you all know, Pleasant Bay, you can see really well in this photo, it really has a lot of marsh area. About a total of almost 1,200 acres of marsh. I thought I'd just take a step back and say, why do we care? It's really obvious why we care about our physical infrastructure, but why do we care about our marshes? They provide really important habitat for our wildlife, our fisheries. They improve our coastal water quality, serving as a coastal filter for contaminants coming in from land and groundwater. They store atmospheric carbon, providing a service to us to reduce harmful greenhouse gases. They protect our shoreline from storm surge and waves. And they also provide us with great recreational opportunities and their tremendous beauty that we come to expect from our Cape Cod landscapes. However, due to all the things we've been talking about today, they are under threat in their survival, as well as their ability to be resilient to climate change and other stressors. One of the main things that has threatened them to date, sort of before the climate change issues, was coastal development. So we had a severe reduction in salt marshes across the region and in Pleasant Bay, where wetlands were filled, shorelines were hardened, and our salt marshes were deprived of the sediment they need to accrete and grow to face climate change and sea level rise. We have degraded coastal water quality, which we all know a lot about. We've been talking about that a lot over the last several years with our nutrients coming in from wastewaters and fertilizers, causing things like algal blooms and degrading our marshes. They cause conditions where marshes start falling apart. And then sea level rise, the topic of the day, where our marshes are being inundated by the tides and experiencing extensive erosion. And marshes are really unique when it comes to talking about sea level rise because they have to exist at this very narrow range of elevation for these plants to grow. So they don't want the water too high or they become a pond, and they don't want the water too low or there isn't that salt water tide that allows the salt marsh plants to thrive. So sea level rise poses a grave threat to these ecosystems. Some of the other things we're seeing around the region as threats are herbivory, where our vegetation is being removed and really accelerating the rates of erosion and degradation of our marshes. So our marshes are extremely vulnerable, and they're vulnerable in 3 different ways, from sea level rise, waves, and these sediment deficits that we were talking about. And we've seen this widespread marsh loss, and it's continuing through edge erosion, where we have waves and surge coming at the edges and taking apart the marsh. We have an interior deterioration, which is caused by a lot of different things and proceeds as it starts to occur. It gets worse and worse, faster and faster, happening at the edges of our creeks and inside our ponds within the marsh. And we see that as these marshes becoming more open water, less vegetated, and a decrease in their elevation. And then we have this sort of positive place in marsh development and processes where they can migrate into the upland, so they can spread as sea level rises toward land. As the tides begin to flood areas that weren't previously flooded, marsh can grow, providing new habitat for these marshes. These things depend on a lot of factors, such as the slope of that land. If it's too steep, the tide won't get in there. But if it's the right slope, the tide will get in there. If it's able to flood frequently enough, the salinities are right, there aren't adjacent land uses that prohibit that, and there isn't sort of the wrong vegetation cover, like too many trees or something that makes it hard for them to come in there. But you'll see in areas around the Cape where marshes have moved in, whether by restoration or naturally, where you'll see a lot of dead trees and you'll start seeing the marsh grow. And that's one of our places where we look to the future for our marshes. This work I want to acknowledge now is a collaboration that I'm in with USGS. We have several projects we're working on, and this is actually an application of some of their work that we're using as a pilot for work that I'm doing across all marshes in the northeastern national parks, across 13 parks. And so that's Neil Ganju's group in Woods Hole. So just to give you a quick background on how this tool that I'm going to talk about today works, is it's really looking at how marshes, what the sediment budget of a marsh is. And so that tells us that it's really important for a marsh, if it's to continue to grow and expand and keep pace with sea level rise, it has to import sediment to raise its surface. However, many of the marshes instead are contracting, and they're exporting sediment. So they're actually losing sediment to the creeks and the tidal flats, and the marsh is disappearing. And so we have this sort of balance or imbalance of the sediment into the marsh to grow and sediment out where we're losing marsh. However, if we wanted to measure all of the different pieces of this, this is a lot to measure. So we start looking for tools and proxies to estimate these sediment budgets rather than going out and measuring them in every marsh. And this is what USGS has undertaken and provided us with some great data sets to begin working with this data to develop the kinds of plans that we are talking about today. So this is the sort of tool that is our proxy for this sediment budget, sediment into a marsh and out of a marsh. And it's called the unvegetated vegetated ratio, or UVVR for short. So it basically says you've got a marsh, there's an area of it that's vegetated, and there's an area of it that's unvegetated, and we're looking at the relationship between those. So if you have a lot of vegetation, you have a very low UVVR, and if you are a bare marsh, you have a very high UVVR. So low UVVR is good, you have a good, healthy growing marsh, and a high UVVR is an unhealthy marsh headed towards deterioration. And this proxy takes into consideration a lot of different factors of the marsh, but USGS has developed this curve from taking measurements within marshes across the Northeast, and they've found that basically you have a surplus of sediments here at the lowest UVVRs, where there's a lot of vegetation, and those marshes can actually transition into upland, so they're not a good, they get too high for our marshes. And then as you move here, you've got marshes that are vegetated, but are kind of at that perfect level. And then as you move down, they're losing sediment, where these marshes down here are bare, and they're having a lot of erosion, and they're very unhealthy. And what this looks like is you have a marsh here, the yellow is vegetation, a very healthy marsh. As you move down this curve, you start seeing these black areas, which are these open water conversions, interior deterioration at these kind of middle UVVRs. And then when you're at these high UVVRs, your marsh is beginning to get lost or is lost. So there's this kind of sweet spot. So what I have done with data provided by this group, Kate Ackerman and Zafar Defne at USGS and Woods Hole have done this work to provide these data so that they can be used by people like us. We've delineated all the marshes here in Pleasant Bay. There are 180 hydrologically distinct marsh units. When you think of a marsh, though, that might consist of maybe 10 or 12 of these units together. However, each unit sort of acts differently. It might have a creek going through it or a ditch or something that makes it behave differently than the marsh that is right next to it that's part of the same marsh system. And so we have marshes throughout the whole of Pleasant Bay. We have different kinds of marshes. We have fringing marshes. We have more intact marshes. We have the back barrier marshes that Mark was talking about earlier. We have here the jackknife and some of the marshes we've been talking about. So we've dealt with all of these pieces as, in some ways, unique units because they have different management actions that might need to be taken in order to restore their resilience. We also looked at marsh elevation. Now this is in a different notation. This is relative to mean tide because we're pretending we're a marsh plant, so we don't really care about a lot of other things, but we care about the middle between our mean high water and mean low water. That's where we like things to be. And so my goal was to determine the mean optimal marsh elevation and elevation range for these areas for resiliency into the future under these sea level rise scenarios. And so we can see here we've got very low elevations in the warmer colors, higher elevations in the cooler colors, and then this middle range is sort of the optimum range for marshes, and this is how it lays out across Pleasant Bay, where we have a lot of optimal conditions out here along the back barrier and a lot of suboptimal conditions in the interior of the bay. Back to our tool, our proxy, the UVVR, where we have calculated the UVVR for each of these marsh units, and we are looking for that optimal marsh stability where there's a good balance in that sediment budget to help these marshes maintain their elevations and keep their range relative to sea level rise. And here again, the warmer colors are low UVVRs. In this case, that's good. Though some of these might be a little bit too high for being at that 0.1. Right here, around here in the white colors, those are optimal UVVR where there's sufficient vegetation to maintain the sediment budget. And then those that are blue are really devoid of vegetation to an extent where they're unstable. And so we can see some of these highlighted here, like Muddy Creek, which we've talked about a few times now, that marsh is in pretty bad shape. And these are some of the reasons why: the vegetation and the elevation. And then there's another place here on the barrier beach. But a lot of the marshes are actually in a pretty good state in these red and white colors for their vegetation and are prepared for the future in terms of their sediment budget. So the most exciting part of this work is to be able to apply this tool that USGS has developed called the lifespan tool, where they take all this information and they estimate the actual lifespan in years of a particular marsh. And so what we see is that we are able to calculate the lifespans for all these 180 marsh units under different sea level rise scenarios. And as you've heard as a theme today, for those of us who have been working in this world for a while, back in 2007, 2010, we were talking about, a 20, 30 centimeter sea level rise. This work was started about 5 or 6 years ago. We were talking about maybe a 50 centimeter, 1.5 foot sea level rise. These things are out the window now. And so I'm gonna pretty much be focusing on this 3 foot sea level rise by 2100. And this lifespan tool that we're applying incorporates all of these pieces that I've talked about. The vegetation state of the marsh, how the sediment is moving, even the vegetation biomass, how much root biomass is in the marsh to hold it together, the marsh elevations, and this global mean sea level. And what we see here is this is in years. So we've divided the bay into marshes that have lifespans of kind of less than 25 years. So these are marshes that are not long for this world in the sea level rise scenarios. Ones that are about 75 years old, which puts them in a kind of prioritized management scenario. And then those that are stable with a lifespan of greater than 300 years. And what we see is, again, that the barrier beach, back barrier marshes are in pretty good shape. They have long lifespans for the most part, except when we get down near the North Inlet. But there are a lot of marshes that we think are very important to us that are more in that 75 years or less range. And so that's what I'm going to begin diving into now. All right, so here we have the lifespan of these marshes on that 1.5 foot sea level rise, but I'm going to just introduce you to the figure and then move on to the 3 feet because it's more relevant. So if they're blue, they are around for more than 75 years. If they're kind of in the yellow, orange, red range, they're around for less than 75 years. So this is the map that is most relevant to today, where we see that if we change that scenario, we lose a lot of our blue. So a lot less of our marsh is stable into the future, meaning that they're not resilient to sea level rise and the climate change. And most of our marshes are falling into these yellow, red, and orange ranges, which means they're very vulnerable to climate change. Essentially what this looks like is I have the 1.5 meter sea level rise in the dashed line, and then the 3 feet, 1.5 foot, and then the 3 foot in the solid lines, and these are the lifespans less than 15 years. We don't see a big difference there when we increase the range, but we see a huge difference here. So we've moved a lot of our very stable marshes here that were greater than 300 years, their lifespans have gotten shorter and shorter. And so as we continue to raise our sea level rise projections, we're not going to have a lot of marshes in this stable, resilient area. And so that's where we have to step in and make plans for action. So we have developed a way to prioritize and make decisions about which marshes to focus on because we have so many. And one of the ways we can do that is to use these proxies, this proxy of the unvegetated to vegetated ratio, the UVVR, and the elevation of the marshes, and make some decisions about how to manage them. We know that low UVVR is good. That's a lot of vegetation on our marsh. High UVVR is bad. High elevation is better than low elevation. You have a lot of flooding at low elevation. Your marsh is drowning. At higher elevation, it has more likelihood of success. And so we can populate this, this matrix where we have low elevation, so a lot of flooding, very bare. These marshes we categorize as an area where we would do nothing. We would abandon it. It has a low lifespan. It has little likelihood of successful restoration, and a lot of effort involved. So those get classified as abandoned. On the other side, there are marshes that have a lot of vegetation and are of appropriate elevation. Those are ones that we're going to identify to protect into the future because those might be the marshes that are here in 300, 400 years. So we're going to make every effort today not to allow them to continue to deteriorate by all of the threats that we have around us. And then the middle range, those are the ones for action. So where we have bare marshes but high elevation, so they're in a good position relative to the water levels, and they just need some vegetation, we might decide to do some restoration there where we can go out and vegetate these areas and increase their survival into the future, make them more resilient. Then we have some other ones where we have a lot of vegetation, but they're very low in the tide range. Those places, they aren't lost right away because they have this vegetation, they have potential, We may choose to monitor these for the next 10 years or so, see how they do, see how our sea level rise projections play out. So they may fall into this monitor, and they kind of straddle this monitor, restore, and some of the things that we're going to talk about today is how do we decide which ones are in these categories, and a lot of that comes down to you, the stakeholders, which marshes are important to you, because if one of these is really important, then we may choose to take some actions to make sure that it moves into that greater than 300-year lifespan area. In addition, a lot of the other parts of this work that you're hearing about, as we sort of merge all of that information, we may prioritize marshes that fall into this monitoring category for some kind of restoration action. So this is where we've done an analysis to put the marshes into these categories of abandon, restore, monitor, and protect, so that we can begin to prioritize areas that we should be looking at for some kind of resiliency action. And again, I put this in here, but these things really are pretty irrelevant because we're really moving towards a much higher sea level rise scenario. So focusing here, we have the blue areas, which are marshes that have long lifespans. In the dark blue, it's greater than 300 years. In the turquoise blue, greater than 150 years. And so those marshes are pretty stable. Some of them are the ones that Mark was showing in the back barrier, very important marshes that will continue to build as the barrier beach moves through its geologic processes. They will continue to get sediment and hopefully continue to build and survive. There are areas on the barrier beach that are more vulnerable, but in general, it's looking pretty good. We do have areas along Hog Island, up in the ponds, Muddy Creek, as well as Strong Island and Simpson Island area, where there are some really vulnerable marshes that have less than 75 years, where we might prioritize some action. Zooming in a little here, we've talked about Muddy Creek. That's an area where there's already some work going on. Mark's data is really interesting because even if we did some marsh restoration on the outside of that area, the flooding storm tide pathway is actually from the inside, so we would need to do it on the inside too, which has been identified here. That's a high priority area. We have a few other areas where we might choose to do some restoration along in this zoom. And so I think that this is a great tool for us to start the conversation on which areas are the most vulnerable and how we might start approaching that action phase. Some other things to note, I'm going to move over here to the higher sea level rise scenario, is we have marshes that are in the more vulnerable states, say in either yellow or this peach color, that are adjacent to stable marshes. So those might be ones where we actually invest in to make them more stable and to really strengthen a marsh that already has some strength. We have some marshes that are so low or are in such bad shape that they're in the abandoned category as well. So these are all details that we need to look at in terms of selecting areas for some sort of management action. So overall, I've highlighted here in the map, these are the areas that have been identified for restoration in yellow as priorities based on this lifespan tool and the UVVR. So it's important now for all of us to have a conversation about what marshes are important to the stakeholders of the bay, as well as to the other priorities that exist bay-wide in terms of infrastructure, tide pathways, and other questions that we have. But in general, we have about 400 acres of marsh that are stable, and we should be really focusing on maintaining those areas, protecting them. We have about 200 that have been identified here in yellow for priority restoration because of their short lifespans and their characteristics. Not all of them will be feasible. That's another question. And then we have about half of them in this monitor category, which is, you know, they have a lifespan of less than 150 years, so they're not stable. They're not urgent today, but they may be really important and things that we need to be looking at and considering for restoration, especially if we can find some that are adjacent to other healthy areas to improve. I said earlier that I was looking for the optimal marsh sort of resiliency elevation, and we've found that to be with a mean of about 2 feet above this mean tidal water, this mid-range between mean high water and mean low water. That provides some stability with the sea level rising into the future. And that optimal marsh range is about 1 to 5.5 feet above this mean tidal water measurement. And so those are the areas, we want all of our wetland areas to be in this range. They're not. And so those are the sort of targets that we're seeking as we seek restoration. So the next steps that we have in taking all this information and moving Pleasant Bay marshes towards their future resiliency is to continue to apply this lifespan tool, which has the ability to actually manipulate the features of your marsh. Say you decide you want to restore and you want to vegetate the area, then you can decrease your UVVR, improving your marsh stability, and increasing your lifespan. And so we can actually put numbers into this tool and with different marshes to see what might need to happen from a restoration point of view to make it more stable and increase its lifespan substantially enough to make us happy if we choose to do restoration. So we can basically look at these marshes that are in this 15 to 150 year range and explore these scenarios of increasing vegetation or needing to increase elevation in order to restore these marshes. And then we want to look at these marshes that have lifespans of greater than 150 years to explore opportunities to protect them and really actively protect these areas. And as I mentioned earlier, there's other reasons to manage, not just lifespan, and that's where the value of these marshes to stakeholders and to towns and to infrastructure comes in. And so we overlay that and prioritize that above these natural features. So I'm just going to walk through a quick example of how you can use the tool to kind of work through a restoration action. This is a marsh that is a higher elevation, so it has a good elevation relative to sea level rise. It's become ponded because it has a high UVVR, not a lot of vegetation, so the elevation in some areas has decreased. And it has a kind of long lifespan, 141 years, but let's say we decided that this is a really important marsh. So what we might do here is try to drain the ponds, improve the hydrology of the pond, and plant half of this area. We've now improved our UVVR and increased our lifespan by 100 years. So this would be a good candidate for restoration, because that's really buying us sufficient time to make this marsh resilient into the future. Whereas other scenarios, you might do all this work and go through this process, and it might have increased the lifespan by 20 years. And then you say, that's not worth it for us. And so as we prioritize the marshes, we'll go through and look at some of these scenarios. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. And I think what's striking me, listening to Mike and Maeve and Sophia, now we're going to hear from Alyssa, is, really significant threats, but some options for hope and action. So really, really useful analysis and information. Now I'd like to welcome Alyssa Novak, who's going to speak with us about eelgrass restoration.
Hi, so today I'm going to be talking about a site selection model that we used to help us identify sites for eelgrass restoration and rehabilitation. So since I am an educator, I have to get everybody on the same page and teach you a little bit about eelgrass, what it is, and why it's important, so why you should care. So eelgrass is not salt marsh, it's not algae. It's a marine angiosperm, and it is most closely related to corn and lily, so it's not a true grass. It's the dominant species we find here in the northern hemisphere, and it grows submerged. That's the key here. So it grows underwater, and it grows in estuarine and marine environments, and it grows to depths of about 20 meters. It can form extensive beds or meadows that can be monospecific, so it consists of one species or a number of different species. So in order to differentiate between eelgrass and algae, I'm just going to quickly go over this. Eelgrass has leaves, and these leaves are vascularized, and so they have veins on them. And these veins are used for internal transport of nutrients and oxygen. They also have roots and rhizomes, which help to anchor them into the ground. Algae do not have that vascular system, and they also do not have roots and rhizomes. So this is eelgrass. The video doesn't, nope, no video. Okay, it's pretty. So this is eelgrass. If the video is running, you'd see it's underwater. It's not exposed. And then the other thing you would see in the video is that there are a number of different organisms that are found within the bed. So this is why you should care about eelgrass meadows. They help to stabilize sediment. And so this is important because it protects shorelines from erosion. It also prevents the sediment from moving into channels, so you don't need to dredge them as often. They also help to trap and cycle nutrients, so if you have extra nutrients in the system, they can uptake them, and this improves both water quality as well as water clarity. They're also a health indicator, so if you see eelgrass disappearing from a system, you can assume that the system is having issues with water quality, and you might need to take some steps to improve it. What a lot of people don't recognize is that eelgrass stores a lot of carbon. It can store twice as much carbon per unit area as terrestrial forests, and this helps to mitigate for climate change. And so this carbon stays below ground for thousands of years. And so if you remove an eelgrass bed, all of that carbon starts to go back out into the atmosphere. And then lastly, eelgrass is important for providing food and habitat to a number of different organisms. Some of those are endangered, and then some of those are commercially important, such as scallops. So in Massachusetts, we've seen a 50% decline in eelgrass since 1994. Out here on the Cape, we've seen a decline between 52 and 56%. In Pleasant Bay, there's been a loss of about 55% since 1951. This is due to changes in the tidal inlet as well as increases in watershed development. So as you increase the watershed in terms of development, you get excess nutrients, and this can have a negative impact. So in general, eelgrass is nutrient limited. So if you start to give it nutrients, that's a good thing. It begins to grow. But as you continue to increase the nutrients, you start to get epiphytes. These are the little red dots on the plants. And these epiphytes block the plants from receiving light, and so they are no longer able to photosynthesize. As you continue to increase nutrients even more, you then get macroalgae growing in the system, which you see right here, and that begins to smother the plants. Eventually they die, and you get a system that's devoid of eelgrass, and you only have phytoplankton in the system. And over here is a picture showing you a eutrophied system, which is not very pretty. So in Pleasant Bay, we don't need to worry about sea level rise for eelgrass beds because the beds can accrete like salt marshes over time, and we've looked at that information, and we know they are keeping up with sea level rise. What they are not doing well is they're having issues with increasing sea surface temperatures. So this part of the globe, or this region, is warming faster than any other place on the planet, and we're expecting an increase by about 2 degrees Celsius by 2050. So under normal conditions, eelgrass, their distribution is limited in the shallow areas by temperature, and then in the deeper areas by light. When you start getting these high temperature events, the plants that are in the more shallow zones can't handle that extra temperature, and so they end up dying back. And then you start getting the same issue on the deep edge, where you get the plants not being able to tolerate low light levels as well as the stress of temperature. So you get a general contraction of the bed. So in order to deal with loss of eelgrass, we perform restorations, and they've been happening since the 1930s. And what we do is we use seeds or vegetative shoots or a combination of both. And the process involves identifying the stressors. You can't go into a system and start restoring eelgrass unless you know what the stressors are, because then your restoration is not going to be successful. We then spend a lot of time selecting sites within a system. So even though a system may support eelgrass, it doesn't mean that every little microhabitat is good for restoration. Then we spend a lot of time identifying donor populations, because not all populations transplant equally into a system. And then lastly, we try to spread our risks. So if we're putting in a 1 acre eelgrass bed, we don't do that all during a summer. We try to do that over a couple of years in case we have issues with weather events. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of pros to doing a restoration. It helps to increase the ecological and economic services within that environment. It also helps to facilitate natural recovery, especially if these beds are recruitment limited. It helps to raise public awareness because most people don't know what eelgrass is. But on the flip side, eelgrass restorations are very expensive. Here in Massachusetts, they can cost up to about $400,000 per acre, which is very, very expensive. So it's better to protect them rather than restore them. And then also success rates are very low. In terms of seeding, you get about 1 seed that survives out of every 100 you put out. And then in terms of shoots, you might get 20 to 30% success. So there's a lot of effort you put in to get very low success rates. So now I'm going to start talking about site selection model that we are using to help us identify locations for restoration as well as rehabilitation in the system. And we have, there's a lot of things that we're doing to try to increase our rates of restoration. And so I'll talk about those as well. But what our site selection model does is it uses multiple parameters that influence the establishment and growth of eelgrass, and those include light, bathymetry, sediment, hydrodynamics, water quality, temperature, historical distribution, and conflicting uses. And I'll go over some of those in a few minutes. And then what this model does is it weighs each of these parameters based on how they influence the establishment and growth of eelgrass, and combines them into a multiplicative rating to help us prioritize sites. So now I'm going to talk about the model that we use to help us identify sites for restoration, considering worst case scenarios for increases in sea surface temperature. And then I'll talk about the second model that we use to identify sites for rehabilitation. So the first parameter we looked at was light. We gathered PAR information, which is just photosynthetic active radiation. Probably doesn't mean anything to anybody, but the plants need light. So we gathered that information from the system. That was collected from National Park Service's I&M long-term water quality monitoring program, and we had data from 2007 to 2021. And what we did with that data is we converted it to something that we could be able to identify the amount of light the plants were getting on the bottom. So we looked at the percentage of surface irradiance reaching the bottom. We then used literature values to help us calculate thresholds for survival. So any areas that were receiving less than 20% surface irradiance, we excluded from consideration, and those areas are in red. Any areas that were between 20 and 35%, we say are light limited, and that's where plants are, they're just struggling to survive. And those areas are defined in orange. Any areas that were receiving between 35 and 58%, we know they're getting enough light to survive, but they can't grow and expand. So they are defined in the lighter green. And then any areas that are receiving more than 58% surface irradiance, it means that they can survive, they can grow, they can expand. And so those became our high priority sites, and those are in the deep green. The next parameter that we put into our model is sediment information. And this sediment data was acquired from the Center for Coastal Studies. We identified areas where eelgrass couldn't grow, and so those are areas that consist of silt clay in the system, and or more than 70% silt clay. And the reason why the plants can't grow here is because the soil is anoxic. And so as you can see in this layer, any areas that are in red, we should never plant in them. Green areas are good. And then the next parameter we considered in our model is the predicted distribution and abundance of eelgrass based on worst case scenarios for sea surface temperature increases by 2050. And this layer came from USGS with funding from the National Resources Preservation Program. And this layer was calculated using all those values or parameters I discussed before, such as bathymetry, that's the depth that eelgrass can grow to, older sediment data, as well as hydrodynamic information. And so in this layer, you can see any areas that are in green are areas where eelgrass should be growing in 2050. The next parameter we started looking at was the current distribution of eelgrass. This layer was acquired from Mass DEP. We don't want to restore an eelgrass or areas that already exist for this particular model, and so we wanted to eliminate all these areas from consideration. And so we use this as we call a mask. And so any area that's in green is an area that we eliminated from consideration because eelgrass is currently growing here. The other layer that we were looking at is conflicting uses. We don't want to plant anywhere where there are docks and piers, aquaculture, in mooring fields. So even though the environmental conditions might be good, so light is good there, sediment is good, we do know that these human activities could have a negative impact, and so we excluded these from consideration. And then the last parameter we used was water quality information. So starting in 2007, the Pleasant Bay Alliance started a citizen science program where they started collecting water quality parameters. And we use this information to just make sure any sites that we are prioritizing for restoration, they actually have improving water quality. And so all the areas that are in blue are where water quality is increasing through time. So this is a Venn diagram just showing you basically how the process works. We take the light and sediment data, we multiply it together to reduce the amount of acreage, prioritize sites. We then start putting in information on worst case scenarios for sea surface temperature rises to further eliminate areas. Same with current eelgrass distribution. And then we use the conflicting use information and water quality information to help us interpret our results. And so this is what the process looks like. This is our light data. When we start adding sediment information, as well as removing areas where plants can't grow because light isn't enough, you see that we now have areas where eelgrass should be eliminated from consideration for restoration. Then when we start putting in worst case scenarios for sea surface temperature, you see that more areas are eliminated from consideration. And then we start adding current distribution of eelgrass, we further eliminate areas from consideration. And so this is what our final map looks like. Areas that are in orange have low priority. Areas that are in yellow have moderate priority, and then areas that are in green are high priority. When we add the conflicting use information, you can see that we further eliminate locations. So any areas that are in gray are either mooring fields, aquaculture areas, or docks and piers. And so some of the areas that we identified that might be suitable for eelgrass are actually not suitable because we have conflicting uses there. And so we have approximately 400 acres that we can consider for restoration under worst case scenarios. So this is what it looks like in terms of numbers. For low priority, we have about 270 acres. When you add conflicting uses, that brings it down to 162. Moderate priority, there's 187. With conflicting uses, it brings it down to about 100. And then high priority is 171 acres. With conflicting uses, it's about 113. 113 acres is a lot of acreage to work with in terms of eelgrass, and so we like these numbers. So the next thing we did was we wanted to identify sites for immediate rehabilitation. Doing rehabilitation is much easier than restoration, and rates of success are much higher. And so what we did is we took information from the National Park Service's Tier 2 Baywide program. This was started in 2002, and we looked at the current eelgrass distribution in 2022. And we looked at abundance throughout the system, and we identified all areas that had less than 25% cover. So that means that they're low density areas or low percent cover. And those are all identified in green. So there's a lot of areas that have low percent cover, so they could be rehabilitated. The next thing we did was we took the light information again, and we identified all those sites where surface irradiance reaching the bottom was greater than 20%. So we know the plants would be able to persist based on current light conditions. And then we combine that information together using the same type of logic I showed you before to get this output layer, showing you areas that have greater than 20% surface irradiance but low percent cover. Any areas that are in orange are low priority. Those that are in yellow are moderate priority, and then those that are in green are considered high priority. When we start adding the conflicting use information, which again are in gray, you can see that we have about 570 acres that we can start to rehabilitate, which is, again, another great amount of acreage that we can start to work with. So this is a breakdown by category. Again, we have about 137 acres as low priority. Once you start adding conflicting uses, it goes down to about 99. Moderate priority is 186. With conflicting uses, it goes down to 167. And then high priority is 327. When you look at the areas outside of conflicting use areas, it's 294. So in terms of next steps, we are going to be starting doing restoration and rehabilitation work starting next summer. We have a unique program going on where we're trying to identify donor sources that are more resilient to temperature stress, and we're using some genomics to identify those populations, and so we're trying to get those populations into the system to help this bed or this entire system survive these increases in sea surface temperature. So just in conclusion, again, we have about 330 acres outside of conflicting use zones that we can work with in terms of restoration where there's no eelgrass. And then we have 570 acres that we can start to work with where eelgrass exists, but it's not doing too well, that we can improve that, the overall coverage. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. And I'd like to invite Mike, Maeve, and maybe Sophia up. And we do have time for, well, we're a little over time, but I think we'll make up for it. Maybe just a few questions, if there are any from the audience. And there's Kristen.
Very interesting. Are there any studies that show the impact of wakes on marshes and eelgrass?
All right, so are there specific studies that focus on that? I'm not sure, but certainly it is something that is included in a lot of studies of marshes, and wakes are a big problem for marshes. They generate significant waves, and so marshes that are near harbor entrances and channels really do suffer from wake damage.
So, and there are two things, because you have big and small wakes, but you have big and small motors. So, particularly in the Narrows, in Pleasant Bay, that could be a problem, and we need to study that more, is what I'm saying, because these are things that we can do something about as well. Thank you.
I can expand on that a little bit too. So in terms of wakes, that increases turbidity in the system, and so we have more sediment, and that reduces water clarity, and so the plants don't get enough light and they end up dying back. But then in terms of motors, they can create prop scars, and that's a huge issue. So as the boats run through the eelgrass beds, they make these giant scars, and that rips up the eelgrass, and it takes about 100 years for plants to go from an area that's about a meter squared to an acre. So they're very slow growing if they're just expanding vegetatively. So you can imagine it might be, if you put in a prop scar, that might take 10 to 15 years for that area to fill back in. And so just avoiding eelgrass beds is great.
Thank you. I have a question for Alyssa. When you were talking about the next steps for rehabilitation and some restoration work of the 550 acres that have been designated, We're going to do that. Who's the we? Who's directing the work? Who's doing the work? And who's funding the work?
Holly, did you want to chat a little bit about that? I feel like Holly should come up. I'm working with the National Park Service as well, and this is on National Park Service property. And so Holly should, I'm happy to speak for her, but I feel like since she's here, she should speak.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Holly Playstead. I work for the National Park Service, and the restoration that we'd be starting would be very small scale pilot based on the work that Alyssa has done and presented today, just to start to, we have to see what is going to work in the system before we do any sort of large scale restoration. And then large scale restoration requires lots of permitting too. So we're talking about small scale that's just funded by the National Park Service.
A lot of wonderful information. I'm really impressed. I did have a question on Jackknife Harbor, and perhaps that's being addressed separately, but it seemed to me that the way the bridge is constructed and the way the water flows is having a tremendous impact on the erosion and any possible restoration there. I wondered if any consideration had been given to flow structures within the bridge that could deflect the water flow from the Jackknife Beach.
We'll hand that one over to Ted.
I think I heard the question. With the opening of the bridge, is there anything that is being done to reduce the current flow? Was that where you were going, Michael?
Could you put any kind of a flow deflection device that would...
Could you? I'm sure you could. Yeah. When that bridge was designed, and I was not involved in that project very much, so I'm somewhat winging it here. It was designed to sort of anticipate what the flow would be with the goal, and I was actually interested in the whole marsh restoration kind of discussion, because you didn't have much, if anything, in the Muddy Creek upstream, which one of the goals was, from a marsh perspective, I'm jumping around your question, was to enhance the marsh restoration naturally through tidal introduction upstream. So I think we've miscalculated some of the benefits of marsh growth just in that upstream area. So that's a good thing. Again, the water flow coming in and out of Muddy Creek, you know, I think there is definitely some evidence that it's incorporating, or not incorporating, it's impacting the edge erosion right along the entranceway. As was indicated earlier, we do have a study, a project in the works right now to address the edge erosion and to restore some of the marsh fringe loss along the edge of the roadway. I don't think simply slowing down that water flow is going to, you know, help that much. You'd really have to do a lot of structures along the whole edge of the marsh system. We actually looked at that during this study. There wasn't a lot of appetite for that approach. Even just from the regulatory perspective, they don't like to see structures like that go into that system, even though the purpose was to benefit the ecosystem. So I think regulatorily, it would have been a somewhat non-starter. And whether or not putting anything into the bridge opening itself would have, you know, changed that system, I'm not sure it would have changed it to the positive. So that was completely a winging it here, as though I think I know what I'm talking about.
And yes, Ted, I've identified a few areas that are not included, and so if those are areas that become prioritized, we'll go ahead and develop the data for those areas. Any other questions?
On the salt marsh and the abandoned areas, I noticed that one large one was on the Barrier Beach opposite Strong Island. And I would think that if the salt marshes on the backside of the Barrier Beach help maintain the Barrier Beach, that those would want to be the highest priority to try to do something about. All we have to do is look at what's happened with the Barrier Beach going away at Morris Island to see that we don't want the Barrier Beach to the north to go away.
Yes, absolutely, and I think that's where it's really important for Mark and I to get together and kind of match up our two data sets and say, you know, that's an area where maybe that overwash hasn't yet developed but is going to, and we will get some sediment flow over that area which will help that marsh, or that it is an area that is weak and losing the marsh could be a problem for an inlet or something like that.
And yeah, I think that those areas behind the Barrier Beach, if, as I said, they're important to maintaining the Barrier Beach, would be way more important than the ones inside the bay.
Carol, can I ask a question? These forums are a great opportunity to kind of cross-pollinate different ideas and projects. I would suggest, Sophia, that when you're identifying salt marshes to enhance or preserve, you should consider the environmental benefit of nitrogen removal. Carol mentioned the watershed permit that the towns are working under, and the watershed work group, maybe as early as next Thursday, is going to start to talk about the degree to which the town's nitrogen management programs might take advantage of natural attenuation through salt marshes. And to put things in perspective of all of the watershed loading that the towns have committed to under the watershed permit, about 20 or 25% of that might be accommodated by healthy, long-lived salt marshes. So from managing the nitrogen loading perspective, we need to think about, you know, if there's a resource there, let's protect it. If Sophia tells us it's nice now, but it's going to be gone in 10 years, and maybe we can't. So there's a good example where praise for all of you and all the ideas you bring to the table, but lots of programs that can cross-pollinate.
Yeah, and I'll add to that that a lot of the fringing marshes, say around like Ryder Cove and Crow's Pond, all of those have long lifespans, and so maintaining those will be really relevant to providing that filter that we need to protect water quality.
And if I can just jump onto that too, what Mike just said is that denitrification benefit doesn't occur in the water column. The action happens at the sediment interface layer. So the eelgrass project, the health of sediment, knowing where we are and prioritizing is really beneficial. So particularly with the eelgrass presentation, I'm feeling very positive, even though this is a very long-term step, but really good data. Thank you.
A little more for Sophia. I'm especially interested in salt marsh restoration. And, you know, we talk a lot about beach renourishment, but when it comes to marshes that are a little bit low in elevation, I understand there are some projects that are looking at sediment addition, thin layer sediment addition. What's your assessment about the efficacy of those approaches to helping to restore some of the marshes that might be a little bit on the low elevation side? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. We feel very confident that augmenting sediment in marshes is very useful and very productive at maintaining their position in that tide range for the marshes, particularly existing marshes where we have vegetation. You can actually add sediment to a somewhat healthy marsh, and the thin layer is sort of a misnomer. It actually needs to be quite thick. And we are doing some experiments in the seashore of Steve Smith and really across the state to figure out what that thickness is. There's some work in Rhode Island also. in some more microtidal environments. So it's really, really looking good. Right now, from a regulatory standpoint, it's impossible in Massachusetts, but we are also working with regulators to change that. And like Holly was saying with the eelgrass, we are doing a lot of piloting, things that are don't need to be permitted in the Park Service, what we can do on our land. And we're learning quite a lot, and that is really one of the only options for those low elevation marshes is to build them up by applying sediment. It is hard. You need, the feasibility of every marsh, you can't get there. You need the right sediments. We're finding sand to be really productive, even in marshes that are peat. So yes.
Can I add on to that?
Yeah, sure.
I was actually going to ask a similar question. The sediment quality or composition, as you just indicated, is very important, which I think seems somewhat obvious. We all know that Chatham and other towns do dredge, but most of our sediments are the more coarse sand, et cetera, which probably aren't necessarily that compatible with some of these internal marsh systems. So if you want to do thin layering, or if it's ultimately identified as an appropriate methodology, where would you be looking for those sediments? Those interior kind of more organic-y, mayonnaise quality type sediments, or a mixture of both, or what are you guys finding on that front?
So absolutely we'd be excluding the black mayonnaise from being a good option, because you want something that's also going to stay there and create the right conditions for the biology. Which is one of the reasons why we're doing some experiments with sand, because we have a lot of sand. We have a lot of access to sand. The sand's moving around. We constantly have to move it out of where it is, and trying to see whether something that we consider to be, very heavy and lacking that organic material, whether that is, whether the marsh is able to survive and grow into that. And so far, we're trying to figure out what the thickness is. So if it's too thick, it's a problem, but there might be some sort of thickness where coarse sand is okay. Historically, in other states where this has been done, it's been kind of somewhere in between, something that we might consider to be a coarse mud that is applied to the marshes and has been somewhat successful, although they're finding after several years that a lot of it has eroded away and they're not keeping pace with sea level rise as they expected from the initial placement, which is why I say thick, because initially everybody was trying to apply thin, and now that's not really working. So it's definitely a learning situation, but we think the heavier with the appropriate thickness is probably the way to go. And we're working with the regulators in Massachusetts to see how that goes.
Well, just another comment on that. I think DEP is coming along in terms of understanding that this is something that needs to be part of the future, and are looking for ways to make that regulatory process a little more workable. Well, thank you very much to our presenters, and great questions and discussion. Really appreciate that. So I'd like to welcome you all to grab some lunch. There are some sandwiches and things in the serving room, which is right through that back door. So please take a few minutes, grab a bite to eat. We're sort of on time, but a little over time. But we'd still like to maybe resume at about 12:30. So if you could just grab a bite, chat with your friends and colleagues you haven't seen in a while, and maybe be back in your seats at that time. We're going to go over the survey results very briefly and then have a panel discussion about how we move forward with this great information to develop resilient strategies. All right, thanks folks. I hope everyone had a chance to grab a bite to eat, catch up with some friends you haven't seen in a while, which is great to do here. A little bit of a thinner crowd after lunch, but that's okay. We'll hope to get you out before too long to enjoy the rest of the Saturday. we had a pretty full morning, I think you'd agree, with a lot of information, a lot of just really cutting edge work, and the beginnings of a framework for how we start to think about, well, certainly assessing the threat, but then what do we do from here? Where do we go from here? And what was so, I think, encouraging about the presentations is that in each step along the way, we heard about the potential for rehabilitation, for restoration, for advanced planning for our infrastructure to, think ahead and be proactive and increase the resilience overall. So we're going to be moving into that conversation in the coming months. This is really sort of a kickoff for that, and we hope you will continue to be part of that conversation with us. And getting your thoughts, your feedback, your concerns, your observations is all part of it. And we're also, trying to reach out as best we can to make sure we hear from all corners of the community. Not everyone can spend several hours on a Saturday morning or during a work day or in an evening if you've got other obligations or work or what have you. So we're trying to create a number of different opportunities for people to weigh in. So one of the ways we've done that is to create an online survey. And it's been available through our website. I think the link was circulated with the invitation for this forum. And I think at this point we have about 145 responses, which isn't a very huge sample size to be sure. But we hope that number will continue to grow. We're going to keep the survey open until the middle of December, and hope that you will pass it on to friends or colleagues or others who you think might be interested in participating. We really want to get as broad input as we possibly can as we undertake this adaptation planning. So I thought I would take a minute to share results to date, just to give you a flavor for the kinds of responses we're hearing from folks. Many of you, I hope, have also participated in the survey. And I'm going to apologize for the near invisible figure here. Very hard to see, but it was the nature of what was outputted from the program we're using, so we'll have to work on that in our final report. But the first question we asked is just, how people enjoy Pleasant Bay, what's important to you, and what we found is primarily the big items are beach walking, swimming, canoeing, kayaking, and just enjoying the view from the shore. So we thought it was an important question to ask just because, some of the ways that we enjoy the bay require access or require, or perhaps it's the salt marshes that you enjoy viewing from the road, and those may be elements that are a threat due to the climate effects we discussed. We also asked folks to give us an idea of, what they're concerned about with respect to climate change. If sea level rises and there's more intense storms. And in terms of the top items that people are concerned about, I'm going to get my cheat sheet out here. The top concerns were loss of salt marsh, loss of eelgrass, shoreline erosion, and loss of sediment movement along the shoreline, which of course is what happens when we revet the shoreline. We lose the ability for that sediment material to, become free and move along and then nourish our salt marshes and our beaches and our tidal flats. So those were the items that were of most significant concern of the list that we provided. And then we also asked people to list a few other things that they might be concerned about that were not on the list that we provided. And we heard that shoaling was a concern, lawns and fertilizers, which isn't necessarily a climate issue, but certainly an issue that we hear a lot about on Pleasant Bay in terms of the nitrogen loading. Intrusion of salt water into the drinking water lens. So that certainly is a climate issue that we had not listed, but certainly one that we should bear in mind. And lack of public access to the bay, and a hope that climate resilience can lead to new opportunities for access. So that was an interesting comment. So important for us to understand what people are concerned about, but also important for us to try to get a handle on the kinds of resilience strategies that the community would support in terms of voting for increased funding at town meeting, or voting or supporting changes in regulation that might increase stringency of regulations that might be needed, or possibly temporarily reducing access to certain areas for restoration purposes. These are all things that are positive, proactive steps, but can require a bit of sacrifice on our part. And so part of what we want to understand is where people are willing to make those sacrifices and support those kinds of actions if needed in a public forum. So the kinds of strategies that seem to, and I will say that almost all of the strategies we listed were supported, but to one degree or another. But those that had the highest support registered were strategies of sand nourishment, so adding more sand to beaches and areas that would benefit from that. Purchasing land to relocate facilities, so such as a public access facility or stormwater, wastewater. Rebuilding of facilities if needed for resilience, and restricting public access to areas for the purposes of regrowing salt marsh, and restricting access to waterways if needed for the purpose of restoring eelgrass. So very interesting in the context of the conversation and the presentations we had this morning. And then lastly, increasing regulation of shoreline erosion or shoreline erosion management. Those seem to be strategies that had high levels of support from the folks who so far have responded to the survey. And other strategies that were noted that we had not listed, just comments that folks made, I'll share a few. Deposit dredge material on Turn Island, invest in green technology, move away from fossil fuels, increase setbacks for development from the shoreline, and replacing culverts with bridges were other strategies. Yes? Oh, sorry. Those were, okay. So just in terms of, then we lastly asked folks to pick the top 3 from those restoration strategies. And the top 3 strategies were purchasing land to allow salt marsh to migrate landward, restricting public access to the shoreline to regrow salt marsh, restricting access to the waterways to regrow eelgrass. And then there were 2 that were very close to number 3 in terms of responses, and they were tied. That would be increasing the stringency of erosion regulation, investing in stormwater infrastructure. So all in all, I think helpful input in terms of giving us a sense of the issues that people are concerned about, which are tracking very much with the kinds of things we're hearing from our presenters today, and giving us some broad outlines of the types of strategies that we know there is some burgeoning support in terms of land acquisition, perhaps, creating environments that might be a little more restrictive to access for regrowing eelgrass and salt marsh, investing in stormwater infrastructure, and possibly rebuilding some of our infrastructure that may be affected by climate effects. So really just very, very initial responses. We'll continue to collect survey responses, and we'll do a more thorough reporting of this, but we thought it would be interesting to share with you today, just to give you a sense of that. And we also want to hear from you today. And that's really what this part of the presentation is about. We're going to invite some panelists up. We have Ted Keon, and Coastal Resources Director for the town of Chatham, and Chris Miller, Coastal Resources Director for the town of Brewster, also a member of our steering committee. Greg Berman is going to join us, and Mike Giggy as well. And we're going to have a little bit of a panel discussion. Yep, Herb?
Carol, if we wanted to encourage others to do the survey, where is that available?
Good question. Thank you, Herb. So the survey is on our website. If you go to the homepage of, pleasantbay.org and you scroll down, there's a couple of ways you can get to it, but the easiest one is that the invitation for this event is on our homepage. You have to scroll down a little bit, and there's a link right on that to the survey. So I'm going to advance the slides a little bit to a couple of panel questions for our panelists. And again, we really want to hear from you as well. Part of what we want to explore in this part of the day is, where do we go from here? And we were talking about this amongst ourselves, amongst our planning group, in terms of how resilience planning is really viewed, within town government. I mean, is it a high priority? Is it a middle priority? Is it something that doesn't usually make it into the conversation? And what are the ways that we can increase the visibility and the effectiveness of resilience planning? So maybe I'm going to start with that question and maybe skip over the first one, because then I'd like to hear more from the audience on that. But maybe to ask our panelists, in terms of how focused we think our towns are on resilience planning, and where it really rates in terms of priorities. There's so many pressing issues facing our towns today, and resource limitations, affordable housing, wastewater planning, and so forth. Just your thoughts about resilience planning and how it fits into that framework.
Go for it. I'll go for it first. Hi, Chris Miller from Brewster. Brewster doesn't have much shoreline on Pleasant Bay, so most of our, we have 40 feet, I think, if we look at it. But most of our resilience planning has been on other parts of town, up on Cape Cod Bay, low-lying roads. So we've participated and had a lot of support from our select board and town administration in climate change adaptation. We've done the MVP process. We have a hazard mitigation plan that's in place, and we also have a Natural Resources Advisory Commission that advises the select board and town staff on, pertinent issues related to shellfishing, to shoreline erosion, to, management of our various resources. So I think we've had a lot of support there and a lot of public interest in it. And, like every other town on Cape Cod, we think locally, but we also use other resources in the area, so we're very supportive of things like dredging. Although we don't have a harbor in town, we have a lot of people with boats that use the various facilities in other towns. So we try and work together, and I think the Pleasant Bay Alliance, participating there, has kept us pretty closely within the 4 towns, coordinating our efforts.
And I support what he just said in the sense of the interest in Chatham, I think, is significant on the resilience issues. There's been similarly a number of studies that the town has got involved with through the MVP program, coastal zone management, resiliency grants. We've gotten repeated grants on that from that group. The select board has been very consistent in support of the projects that we've pursued that have resiliency incorporated into them. We have have had a very extensive sort of waterfront infrastructure program over the last few years. All of our projects take into account resiliency to some aspect. They're very important when we go for grants. The grants themselves have very specific line items. What are you doing relative to resiliency for this type of project? And they want to see that the town has resiliency incorporated into the project before they give out money. So that's a very important, factor in order to get these grants. I've said this before, that the waterfront infrastructure is, and this is all part of a lot of what Mike's looking at, these are difficult issues to really incorporate some of the resiliency components like sea level rise when you're trying to enhance a project that's right on the water. And the fish pier, just as an example, is a good example. Fish pier is obviously a very, very important component to our local industry, the regional industry, the fishing industry, et cetera. but you can't build the fish pier, 10 feet above, where it is now. It sooner or later becomes a non-functioning facility. We just went through a bulkhead renovation. We absolutely designed the new south side of the facility higher than it used to be. It's still going to get wet. So it was also designed to get wet. Let the water come in during a storm, let it flow out and not impact, the facility's function. Utilities and so forth, we try to elevate. So my point is simply that you can't always get these things out of harm's way, but when you can, design them so that they can deal with the flood issues, storm issues, and then go back to normal. So anyway, we are very much focused on the resiliency issues, and we can always do more, but I think we at least have a very, very good handle on, let's incorporate it when we can.
I'll raise a question of you two and others here in terms of structure. With the towns I deal with, it's always nice that there be a point committee. I'm looking at Alan McClellan and others from Orleans here. That there's a wastewater management advisory committee that gets into the issues. So do the 4 towns have a comparable committee that looks at sea level rise, resiliency, et cetera? Question 1. And 2, is there a line item or a set of line items in your formal capital improvement plan?
I'll jump on that real quick. Just the line item, not per se that I am aware of, like a resiliency, funding pot, if you will, to go out into different areas. We have lots of capital issues that incorporate, as I just indicated, resiliency in the project. So it's a neat idea. Take a lot of discussion, with the town, the finance committee, town manager, and the select board. But I guess short answer is no, we don't, that I'm aware of.
But it hasn't gotten in the way.
It hasn't gotten in the way. Yeah. We're not doing resiliency because we don't have that. Yeah. As far as the, a point committee, not really, but sort of. And we have members in the audience. We had an energy committee advising the town on energy policy and ways to, enhance our energy use, et cetera. Their charge got expanded to be a climate action committee as well. And they are very focused and have some very, very passionate, individuals looking at sea level rise, climate impacts. They've had some very interesting discussions with the select board, and they are right now really focused and have a study out for proposal to look at marsh restoration on the south side of Chatham. So, having a committee like that is really focused on these issues is very important, I think going to be very beneficial to the town.
Chris?
Yeah, so your first question, we started with an integrated water resource management planning committee, which was citizen-based and supported by consultants. We got through that process, but now we have a water quality task force. Again, disparate people there that work directly with the select board and through our town manager. That gives advice on not just wastewater issues, but also other water quality issues. And we're very focused on those. In Brewster, a lot of it's about fresh water.
Does that include coastal resilience?
But we had a different committee. A number of years ago, we did several retreat projects where we moved municipal parking lots back away from the coast. That led to a large committee to deal with what are the implications and can we come up with a consensus on climate change. We brought in the Consensus Building Institute and had a year-long process where we came up with coastal, basically a coastal decision-making on what are we going to look at for future sea level rise. Probably could use an update because it's going back about 8 or 10 years ago. And that led to the formation of a coastal committee. That coastal committee brought forward a series of planning articles and white papers. And Carol Ridley helped us quite a bit with that. And we came up with a phase 1 coastal management plan. And I will say that this year on the select board's annual list of priority items, bringing some of those things forward from that management plan is one of their top priorities for the year.
And how formal is it in the capital budgeting?
So the water planning is very formal. We have, $75,000 to $100,000 as a standing line item, plus special projects like we're doing, to deal with the Pleasant Bay fertilizer management and other things. So those are standard. For the coastal area, it's really, we've relied a lot on grants, and CZM has been very good to us over the years, but we don't have a standing line item for climate resilience right now. But we have, as we go through each of these planning processes, like I mentioned, our hazard mitigation and others, gone for specific line items to fund those sources. Good.
And Mike, I know I'm not a town employee, but with Barnstable County and the Sea Grant, I do work with a lot of the towns, so I can answer from a couple other perspectives. So obviously the MVP grants and the CCM grants have been brought up. I know the state of Massachusetts is working on a statewide coastal resilience plan, or doing the RFP. Hopefully that'll be coming out within the next couple of years, and I'm sure they're gonna go through the local communities. That said, a couple of towns actually, well, at least Nantucket already has a coastal resilience plan just for themselves. They also have a coastal resilience advisory committee, and Falmouth, I believe, used to have one. I'm not sure if they're still a functioning body right now, but there have been a couple of those. Within the Nantucket plan, they do have budgeting for various action tasks. I don't think it's lined up with the capital budget yet, but it is, we're going to find grant funding, or they're actually talking about having, coastal resilience districting and potential taxing. It's a pretty comprehensive plan. Hopefully the state will, have something similar. And that's one thing that we're doing within our programs. We actually brought in Shelley McComb, who some of you may have been able to, had the luck to interact with so far today, but she's our new coastal resilience specialist. And, I'm not trying to sell it too much. It's still very early in the process, but I believe she's probably going to be downscaling some of this state coastal resilience planning to make templates or models for towns or even neighborhoods to try to bring it on a more local level.
Greg, I'd like to ask you too, because I know you work quite frequently with conservation commissions in many towns on the Cape. Really, which is really the front lines of dealing with a lot of the effects of climate. What resources or what items would help our conservation commissions deal more effectively with climate change? Are there regulation changes or resources needed or technical support, or are there things that you're observing time and again would be helpful to augment the work of those commissions?
Sure. So some of the things that we've seen, some of the things that we're working on, and some of the things we hope for are a lot to do with regulation. So conservation commissions are primarily a regulatory body, although there is management of land. So the regulations, the state wetland protection regulations are a bit antiquated. And even when they come out, they were potentially poorly worded in some ways. That said, they're probably not getting updated that soon. If you've been holding your breath waiting for the land subject to coastal storm flowage regs, you have a good breath holding ability. So, our groups and the Cape Cod Commission and various other organizations have been working on model bylaws, model regulations, not only for land subject to coastal storm flowage, but there's been other groups that have been working with specific climate change and coastal resiliency regulations that could be enacted on local levels, so you wouldn't necessarily have to wait for the state. And of course, this would be like an a la carte type menu where you can pick the ones that work for your town and kind of tailor them. So that, besides the fact that many town staff are so busy they can't take on additional work, there's if you give them almost a plug and play type template for their commissions to review in the town to decide if they want to enact that, I think that's a nice way to kind of move in the right direction.
Thank you. And Mike, I think this was touched on earlier in the presentation that you may have gave, but in terms of the wastewater infrastructure that's being installed in our communities, how prevalent is resilience in the planning and design of those project elements?
Well, we gave the example of the Hardin Lane pump station, and as Maeve noted, it's good to go for design life, and that's because there are standards that the wastewater industry uses. but I think there needs to be more. There are a few key elevation related, but there could stand to be more than that. And I think if you have the right people, I mean, Harwich has a dynamite wastewater superintendent that is going to ask the questions that aren't easily answered and make sure that happens. So I think all the industries need to, water supply, stormwater management, they all need to be, more focused. And it gets to my comment about the capital plan. I'm going to say, I'm looking at Alan McLennan again, the select board in Orleans, as they're doing their budgeting, is probably going to make sure that there's the right number in there for water or wastewater. And I'm not convinced that we're there yet with the coastal resiliency, that it's expected there will be something, as opposed to, we'll fit it in if you speak up. Well, we need somebody to speak up. We need a committee on top of things. And I think it'd be nice if the select boards knew that, hey, we need to do something. Let's go find out what it needs to be, as opposed to doing nothing if nobody raises their hand. I don't know if that's the case in any of the towns, but in my client towns, things work better when there's a little more formality and structure.
Well, that's sort of a good segue to my next question, which is, it's sounding like from what all of you are saying, there's a lot of, there's an established framework within our municipal governments to address resilience issues. And there's, receptivity to providing funding, although it may not be automatic or, needs to be petitioned as other funding needs to be petitioned. But I guess as we think about developing a climate adaptation and action plan, and, the Alliance has developed a lot of recommendations for our communities, and some of them are readily adopted and some of them not so much. I guess for this particular plan, what guidance or counsel would you provide us, to include or to, make sure in its presentation to get the most, kind of resonance and support and engagement within town government?
I honestly, I'm not quite sure how to answer that. As we've already been sort of suggesting that when we pursue projects, we are incorporating resiliency into it. I'm having, I don't want to say difficulty, that's not really what I mean, but to try to have a resiliency line item, the way town government works, what's the project, what are the issues, as opposed to, well, let's put a lot of money aside when there's so many draws for that money for something that doesn't have a focusedly designed purpose, as opposed to addressing a concept that we all understand conceptually, but what are you going to do with it? They really want, whoever that they are, want to know where this money is going to go. And I'm not discounting, I'm just having trouble figuring how to articulate that into a true focused, budgetary item that has a very direct, use. I get it. I'm just not quite sure in the way town government and budgeting works, how well that will muster or get muster. So
maybe making sure that resilience is not just because it's on a grant application, but that it's an automatic component of planning for all facilities. And
I mean, we do have many, many town projects that, as I'm repeating myself, that have that resiliency component in it. So I just don't know where that would go. And maybe I'm not the right person to respond to that. There may be someone else in town government that says, oh yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And it may be.
Thanks, Ted. Is that on? Can you hear? Is this? Okay.
Yep.
Great. Well, now we'd love to hear from you all. And Mark, I think.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I know that the Park Service has like a maintenance backlog, right? They have certain things that they need to get done, and they sort of chip away at it. So one of the ways that towns could do it is if when like Mike and Maeve do their work and they have this list of priorities, like every town has priorities, right? And if you get those on a list and you start chipping away at those, maybe a line item will start addressing the ones that are most, the highest priority. And through the years, you start chipping away at that list. that's one of the things that you could do. You could take the time, make the assessment town-wide or, you know, Pleasant Bay-wide, say, these are our priorities, and then you slowly chip away at them, and then it's 2% of the budget or 3, or whatever it is. And that's how the Park Service does it sometimes. They have a list of what they need to know, right, or what they need to do rather, and then you just slowly chip away at it.
Yeah, I would even say that's probably one of the main tactile products of a coastal resilience plan, right? So you're gonna have your action items, you're gonna have some kind of budgeting, and then that's how you can actually justify the capital planning to go with the town, that the town has provided input for the plan itself. This is an example that almost was a great example. Town of Bourne actually has a coastal resiliency fund. It was a one-time town meeting approval, and they got a chunk of money. And that money was to be used for coastal resilience. It didn't necessarily have a specific project. It was kind of intended to be used for match for various grants, just to have available, kind of like a rainy day fund. There's going to be a storm eventually. It's our storm fund and various grant matching, things like that. They almost had a dock fee associated with it, that a percentage, whatever dock fee would, you know, fill up this fund over time as people were doing work. It got turned into shellfish mitigation fees, so it doesn't actually fill that fund. But, I mean, a town meeting could approve a certain amount into that fund every year. Just, you know, rainy day fund type thing.
A stormy day fund.
Yes.
So I'm sitting here and I keep looking at resilience planning and municipal priorities. And, you know, I'm struck by what we all know, nothing says municipal priority quite like money and having a line item. Some towns have begun the process, and I think Falmouth is just the most recent, of creating a management position of a resilience coordinator, or however you want to phrase it, which is a real commitment on the part of the town to pursuing resilience measures, because even though we're very hyper-focused here on coastal resilience, because this is all about Pleasant Bay, climate impacts are broader, and resilience is a broader concept, and it's a concept that carries over across multiple town departments, and having one person who's able to look at all of those and figure out how the coordination should work would be a way that the town could manifest its commitment to resilience planning. So I would encourage all towns to follow Falmouth's example and do that.
And Carol, just because, you know, as I was trying to come up with, you know, how that line item would work, I think what Greg did say is a very good step, to have a climate resilience adaptation plan, and then you do establish some of the priorities that you would pick away at, so to speak, that Mark is referring to. You know, we've done that with a number of different things in town. Again, back to Fish Pier, we had a Fish Pier facility assessment plan that identified many, many different deficiencies, and we've been picking away at those once that plan was developed. So I think that would be a good first step, to then give yourself a target and a prioritization, you know, to work on down the road.
I understand that this is a very important meeting coming up on Halloween, and it's going to be the selectmen at work. And I understand that if you have a project you want the selectmen to look at, then you ask. You have several people from this wonderful conference suggest that the selectmen look into what Janet just said, having a regional sort of approach, or just adding it to their bottom line. This is the meeting that you need to be at if you want the selectmen to look at things. It coordinates with the selectmen setting their priorities for the year. I understand that when people come and ask for the selectmen to look into a certain issue, that they do. This is the meeting where that happens. It's Halloween. I have several items I'm going to suggest for the selectmen to look at, and I think certainly this meeting, and the more people who come, remember, selectmen look at numbers of people who come. One of the things I'm going to suggest that they do for Chatham is think about becoming we're already merged. We have a marvelous school system called the Monomoy Regional School System, and we are merged with them in a lot of ways. I think they should look into letting Chatham merge with their community center, because they have the plumbing for a swimming pool. And a lot of us would like to have a swimming pool for our kids to learn how to swim, for us to have swim teams. And I'm going to suggest that they look into a merger with the community center and help supply the activities and the money needed to have a world-class swimming pool behind the Harwich Community Center, which has the plumbing for such a thing. And I think if you asked anybody in Chatham, would you like to have a swimming pool? I think the answer is going to be yes. So the more people who come out and stand and really interact with the selectmen on Halloween, I'm looking forward. I may even wear a witch's costume, but I'm going to be there.
Thanks, Ross.
Let me follow up on what Mike Gigi started here. This morning, we started talking about trying to predict what might happen up to the next 100 years, if you think about it. And in local communities, if you have a charter, it probably says you have to have a capital plan that looks out 5 years. 5 years is nothing. Now, in Orleans, after 7 years of effort that started with yours truly, we finally have a long-range capital planning committee that's going to look at things for 20 years. And this fall, we're starting, and we will have our first input by January 15th. We began to think about long-term planning with our wastewater project, and Chatham has been there ahead of us. But the one item that's been in our capital plan for the last couple of years is a 20-year plan for capital planning in the wastewater project. It wasn't printed, but at least it was given to the town manager. So the numbers are in there and they move every year. The only project in the capital plan that was dealt with that way. So as we think about the projects that we've talked about today, the vast majority of them exceed $25,000. So in effect, they are capital projects. And in the case of Pleasant Bay, we have two avenues to get to our respective capital budgets. Through the professional staff that works with Carol Ridley and our volunteers that work with Carol Ridley. Two avenues to get the input of this information into the planning process. And I think we have the opportunity, we have the information, we've got to figure out how to get it there. All it takes is a memo, and you start the process, and then you have the discussion, and you begin to figure out where in the long-range planning on the financial side these projects should be implemented. And once they get in the capital plan, you can update them every year, move them out, move them up, whatever it is, and nobody gets surprised. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Alan. Other comments, questions? Yes, Alan.
My greatest concern is more basic. I've served also as a water sewer commissioner in Harwich. And I look at the numbers of the amount of water that we pump in a year. Now, you say, oh, why does that matter? Well, 800 million gallons of water the town of Harwich pumps. Now, we pump from the same source that Dennis, Brewster, Orleans, and Chatham pump. So when does the well run dry? So that tells me we need to rethink on how we're doing not just this, but everything. How many more houses are we going to build? how much more development are we going to allow? And then if you do all of that, you know, what do you do with roads and schools? And it's just an ongoing thing. Cape Cod cannot be what the rest of Massachusetts is because it just is, it isn't supportable. So I haven't finished my homework, but my intention was to get the volume of water pumped by those 4 other towns annually and just get a feel of what's going on with the Monomoy lens. So when you're thinking, the thinking has to be much broader than what goes on in the bay or in the ocean, because, I mean, it comes home here. So anyway, that's my spiel.
Thanks, Alan. Truly, resilience is a broad issue encompassing many, many issues.
I think that one place we could go with this information moving forward, inexpensive, huge raising of public awareness, is to be transparent about what is happening on our town websites. Everyone goes to a town website to look up any number of things, and if there can be, and I don't have the answer to whether it should be a tab, a visual, or whatever, but everyone's aware that we need to do things in the areas of mitigation. What's the difference between restoration, rehabilitation? And if we can overlay some of this over neighborhoods, I think that would be a tremendous gift to the people that perhaps aren't yet aware, but sure would appreciate knowing this is where I live. It's a privilege to be here, but yeah, it's a challenge too. And no, I don't get to do anything I can think of, because we need to think in terms of stewardship. That's what the science can do for us, and the engineering can make it happen. Thank you.
So just mentioning as part of the outreach for a lot of these projects, so we've partnered with the Cape Cod Commission, another part of Barnstable County, working on their coastal planner. So that's an interactive website that pulls in sea level rise, pulls in shoreline vulnerability, and you can layer on various adaptation methods. It's planning scale. It's not meant for your house. It's kind of meant for neighborhoods or communities. But that's a site that's available. Perhaps it's not publicized as much as it should be, but it could certainly be linked onto any town page as part of an education.
I also want to, oh, go ahead, Ted.
Kind of similar to that, same thing with the commission. As was indicated earlier, there is the excuse me, ongoing study of low-lying roads through the commission that now, because Chatham and a number of other towns joined this past cycle, if you will, it was a previous cycle, so that all the communities on the Cape are now part of this 2-year study program. If you go to their site and click on however you get through it, the low-lying roads program, you go to your own town, you can start zooming in on street level, well beyond neighborhood level, vulnerability assessments of flooding now and in the future for individual road systems. And then there is a lot of information on it. You click on a certain category and it gives you all this other information. You can spend hours on this thing looking at more things than you would care to even think about. But it is a very, very interesting assessment of where roads are going to get wet, where roads need to be addressed. Chatham, as well as other towns, have selected some roads to be looked at for conceptual ways to improve them. But anyway, that's just a very, very good source for looking at some of these flooding analyses. That's not the town, but it is looking at the very individual level. It's worth checking out.
Thanks, Ted. And I also want to mention that our website, pleasantbay.org, we have a climate resilience page, adaptation page, where we're posting studies, where the survey's housed. And we will continue to build that out. So I think the point made just a moment ago about the need for education to build our vocabulary collectively and our understanding of these issues and the strategies and resources we have available. So we'll try to continue to build that web presence over time. Dave?
Thanks, Carol. One other thing I just wanted to kind of add to the conversation is that we're in a moment right now where, at least for engineering projects, there's a ridiculous amount of funding available, and that's really helpful for municipalities because, you know, you're not going to put this on the tax base or the users for wastewater or something like that. And so I think another piece that you could consider for getting a line item on a budget would be to do a small amount of local investment to do a study that's a concept design for some sort of project. And then even if you don't have the money to actually fund it, that's the tool that allows you to apply for those bigger grants and show that there is need, and then you're a really good applicant to actually get the big money from state or federal funding sources. And it also allows you a little bit more flexibility that if you do the study, you at least understand what the needs are to either plan locally, or in 5 or 10 years, maybe you can do the project. But that it kind of allows you to be informed and get yourself into a good position without having all of the stress of having to fund it in that 1 year category. So I just wanted to kind of add that in to either, you know, maybe there's some local capacity to do that, partner with folks just like, you know, we've seen in this room, or hire some sort of firm to help with that first step, just to set your guys' project straight for future funding.
Other?
I'm sitting here thinking about this question of, do you want a line item in a budget versus sort of more broadly spread? And it makes me think about, I worked in health planning for many years, and during the Obama administration, there was a concept that got promulgated called health in all policies. And what's interesting about it is that it became incorporated into every federal agency, had to include as part of its plan how whatever they were doing affected health. And it interestingly brought in this sort of long-term planning, because it was all based on like how to increase life expectancy and things like that. And it might be something to think about, like, do you really want an individual line item, or do you really want resiliency in all policies? Because just as we've been talking about here today, there are so many dimensions of resiliency, and if you pigeonhole it, it becomes something that sort of goes in and out of fashion. It can be cut. I mean, it's interesting, health in all policies continued through the Trump administration. It's still in the federal requirements. So something that will have longevity is something to think about, you know, strategically. How do you try to get resilience kind of into the DNA of everybody's planning process?
Really, really interesting thought there. Other comments, questions? Shelley.
All this talk of coastal resilience, I feel like I should just introduce myself. Hi, I'm Shelley McComb. I'm the Coastal Resilience Specialist, part of that new funding that Greg mentioned. I am working on some neighborhood scale coastal resilience plans, and I love all this talk of like expanding that to bigger areas or working with the towns. And if you're in a neighborhood that has a need for that, definitely come find me. But I also wanted to say, at a larger scale level, me and a colleague of mine, Shannon Holst, and some people from the Cape Cod Commission are working on a project to implement wetlands regulations and bylaws, and that is going really well. We're having some really, really great conversations of how we can implement that with these long-term, 20-year thinking, like we were talking about earlier. Like, these conversations are happening, and it's really interesting for me to hear all this from you guys on how we can keep incorporating that into these conversations.
Great. Thank you, Shelley. Comments, questions? Michael?
I didn't quite hear the source that Maeve was talking about for engineering funds.
There's a bunch of them, but, you know, for example, the bipartisan infrastructure law has infused a lot of money for infrastructure in general, and like someone had mentioned, they like to see resiliency as something as part of each grant application. You know, it's not gonna be relevant for all projects, but that's a definite plus. And then FEMA has a lot of funding right now, especially in their disaster relief, hazard mitigation grants. And so there's a couple different opportunities for that, but BRIC, HMGP, and FMA grants are really big. And then also the statewide programs like the MVP program and things like that. It just seems that there's an infusion of funding right now that a lot of clients that we see are taking advantage of.
The other thought I wanted to throw out was that with marsh migration being one of the high priorities, it might not be necessary to purchase land. You could purchase what's the term? Just drawing a blank. The restrictions. Yes.
Great idea. Other thoughts, comments? I think this has just been an amazing discussion and so many good ideas and ways of framing this opportunity we really have to plan resilience and you know, many of the comments about incorporating it not as a one thing, but just something that permeates so many other topics. Really, really important thought. I just want to share a couple of things about some of our next steps in this planning effort. This has been a very important opportunity to share information and also to hear from you and to begin this dialogue. We wanted to continue. We have structured a series of virtual workshops that we're planning in late November. There's a sheet by the table in and out today. Grab one with the Zoom information. We'll also be circulating this via emails, and it'll be available on our website. But these are going to be opportunities to take a little bit deeper dive into the particular topics of inner shoreline and intertidal resource protection, public access and water protection infrastructure, and then the barrier beach, salt marsh, and eelgrass resources, where we'll have our speakers again participating and sharing information and engaging in discussion about some specific ways we might move forward with adaptations and plan development and project development and funding and all of the things we're starting to talk about here, but really kind of digging down a little bit deeper into these topics and hopefully coming out of that exercise with some more clarity about specific action items and recommendations we want to incorporate in the adaptation action plan. So I hope if you can, I know it's a lot of time to commit, but I hope you will participate in these workshops. I hope you will spread the word to others, your colleagues, friends, other committee members, and people you're involved with in the community to engage them, encourage them to participate as well. As I mentioned, we have our survey will remain open through the middle of December, so please spread the word. The link's on our website. We'll also always be linking all of these events on our calendar, so that's our new way of sharing information about all of our committee meetings and special events such as this. You can just go to our website, go to the event calendar, and the information will be there as well. We have also just recently prepared a couple of video infomercials that we will be posting to our website, and we're happy to share links of those. So if you are part of a network or organization that sends out an e-newsletter or regularly shares information with a network of people, we'd be happy to provide that information to you, and feel free to share it with your networks. We're trying to think of all the various ways we can get out into the community and engage people in this conversation, because I think if one thing was noted in what we just talked about a few moments ago, it's the breadth of this question, the breadth of this issue of resilience, how it permeates our communities, and we really need to work together to build support and awareness for action. So I think we have had a really encouraging, I think informative day. I hope you've enjoyed it. I really appreciate your attendance and your participation, your great ideas, your commitment to not only Pleasant Bay, but our communities at large. I want to thank our presenters and partners who are just, such experts, and we're so fortunate to have this expertise to work in partnership with. So thank you so much to our speakers and presenters, Ted and Chris also, who are members of our work group and steering committee and technical resource committee, and our partnering organizations who helped us co-sponsor this event. Thank you for all that you have done to help make this a success. So I hope there's a little bit of Saturday left for you to enjoy. Thank you so much, and let's continue the conversation.